I was standing at the checkout counter of a high-end mall in downtown Chicago picking up a bag of my daughter's favorite imported coffee beans before heading over to her house for Sunday dinner. The soothing smell of roasted espresso filled the air until a familiar hand clamped down hard on my forearm. I turned to see Delores, my old neighbor from the south side. Her eyes were wide and she was breathing heavily, looking around as if she were about to pass me stolen goods. "Leon," she whispered, her grip tightening until her nails dug into my skin. "I saw Brad, your son-in-law. He was at the maternity clinic over in Oak Brook yesterday. And Leon, he was not alone. He was holding hands with a young pregnant white woman. He kissed her forehead and told the receptionist he was the proud husband checking in for his wife's ultrasound." My blood instantly turned to ice. The world around me seemed to stop moving entirely. But I did not scream. I did not cause a scene. I did not immediately call my daughter crying. Instead, I looked Delores in the eyes, thanked her for the information, and walked to my car. I was ready to watch the greatest performance of my son-in-law's miserable life. Before I tell you what I did next, let me know what city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like and subscribe button if you believe a father's instinct never fails. My name is Leon Hayes. I am 69 years old and I spent 40 long years building a commercial construction empire from the dirt of the South Side projects. You do not survive 4 decades in the cutthroat world of commercial real estate by reacting to the first swing. You survive by reading the blueprints, inspecting the foundation, and waiting patiently for the structural cracks to show. I started with absolutely nothing but a rusted hammer, an old pickup truck, and a burning determination to succeed. I built my fortune brick by brick. I dealt with corrupt city inspectors, shady material suppliers, and wealthy men who thought they could easily swindle a young black contractor. They all learned the hard way that I possessed the instincts of a starving wolf. I know a scam the moment it walks into a room. I know a liar before he even opens his mouth. Brad Sutton, my daughter Morgan's husband, had always set off my internal alarms. He was 35 years old, handsome in a very generic way, and wore tailored suits that cost more than the first house I ever bought. He spoke with the polished, unearned confidence of a man selling snake oil. He called himself a tech entrepreneur, but I always noticed the small details. His expensive leather shoes were always scuffed at the heels. His eyes constantly darted around a room, measuring the net worth of everyone in it. Morgan was 32, an incredibly successful architect, but she was completely blind when it came to romance. She truly believed Brad was her modern Prince Charming, sent to protect her from the heavy stress of the corporate world. Now driving my sturdy truck down the interstate toward their upscale suburban home, my rough hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. The pieces of a very ugly puzzle were finally snapping into place. Brad had been taking a significant amount of out-of-town trips lately. He claimed he was pitching his business to venture capitalists. He called it a funding tour. I tossed the receipt for the coffee beans onto the empty passenger seat. I did not feel blind rage. Uncontrolled rage is for the weak. I felt a cold, calculated clarity. I was about to walk straight into the lion's den, but Brad was going to find out very quickly that he was not the apex predator in the room. I parked in their pristine circular driveway right behind Brad's shiny leased sports car. When I walked through the heavy oak front door, the rich smell of roasted garlic and rosemary hit my senses. Brad greeted me in this grand foyer, wearing a crisp linen apron over his designer shirt, holding a crystal glass of expensive red wine. "Leon, my man," he announced loudly, clapping me on the shoulder with a heavy, forced familiarity. "I am so glad you could make it. I made your absolute favorite roast today." I looked directly into his smiling face. It was the exact same face that had been kissing another woman's pregnant belly 24 hours earlier. "The roast smells great, Brad," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and my expression unreadable. Morgan came down the wooden stairs looking exhausted, but genuinely happy. She ran to hug me, burying her face in my shoulder. "Daddy, I missed you so much," she murmured. "Brad has been working so hard on this dinner to treat us. He wanted everything to be perfect for you." We moved to the dining room and sat at the long mahogany table. Brad poured the wine, playing the role of the attentive and loving host to perfection. He pulled Morgan's chair out for her and kissed her cheek softly. "You work way too hard, babe," he told her loudly, making sure I heard every single syllable. "You carry so much weight managing your architecture firm. That is exactly why I am pushing these grueling hours with my investors. I want you to retire early. I want to take care of you completely, so you never have to stress again." Morgan beamed, looking at him with absolute pure adoration. "He is so incredibly supportive, Dad," she said, reaching across the table to tightly squeeze his hand. "I honestly do not know how I would manage without him." I chewed my meat methodically. The performance was absolutely flawless. Brad was hitting every emotional note, playing the devoted provider while secretly siphoning the life out of my daughter. I carefully watched his body language. I noticed the way he kept his mobile phone face down on the table right next to his plate. I noticed the way he subtly steered the conversation toward money, assets, and financial security. He was actively buttering her up, preparing the ground for a massive harvest. I just nodded and smiled, offering a polite compliment about the vintage wine. I let him talk freely. I let him inflate his own massive ego. A man who thinks he is the smartest person in the room will always inevitably reveal his own stupidity. As we finished the main course, Brad wiped his mouth neatly with a linen napkin and cleared his throat. The smile on his face grew significantly wider, reaching the corners of his pale blue eyes. "Actually, since we are all here celebrating family tonight, I have some truly incredible news to share," he announced. Morgan looked at him with eager, shining anticipation. Brad reached over and took her hand, rubbing his thumb smoothly over her diamond wedding ring. "Babe, I finally secured the necessary capital for my startup company," he said, his voice dripping with triumphant pride. "The seed round is fully funded. We are going to be wealthy beyond our wildest dreams." Morgan gasped in delight, covering her mouth. "Oh my God, Brad, that is absolutely amazing. Who is the lead investor?" Brad did not blink. His smile remained perfectly frozen in place as he looked directly at me, then back to my daughter. "We are, babe," he said smoothly. "I took the liberty of pulling a second mortgage on this house yesterday. I leveraged our home equity to secure the commercial loan. It is a completely guaranteed return. I signed the final paperwork this morning." The dining room plunged into an absolute suffocating silence. My daughter's house, paid for entirely by her own hard work, was now collateral for a ghost. Morgan stared at him, her mouth slightly open, struggling to process the magnitude of what her husband had just done. A second mortgage, without consulting her at all. Brad quickly reached across the mahogany table and cupped her face in his hands, projecting an aura of absolute reassurance. He spoke in that hypnotic low register he used to pacify her whenever she questioned his decisions. "I know it sounds terrifying, babe, but this is exactly how the wealthy operate. We leverage our existing assets to build massive generational wealth. You have to trust my financial vision." Before she could articulate a coherent response to being put deeply into debt, Brad seamlessly shifted his predatory gaze toward me. He tilted his head, displaying a perfectly engineered look of deep familial concern. "Actually, Leon, this brings me to another highly important matter. I have been meaning to talk to you about your own estate. You have been looking incredibly fatigued lately. Just last week, you forgot where you parked your truck at the hardware store. Cognitive decline is completely natural at 69 years old. Morgan and I worry constantly about you managing all those complex commercial properties by yourself. It is simply too much stress for an aging mind. You should really consider signing over full power of attorney to us. I can manage your portfolio, maximize your returns, and let you finally rest." Morgan, still visibly reeling from the mortgage revelation, nodded slowly. She was desperately clinging to his narrative. "Brad is right, Dad," she whispered. "You have been working your entire life. Maybe it is time to let us take the wheel. You do not need to carry this heavy burden anymore." I looked at my daughter. She was a brilliant woman in a corporate boardroom, but completely defenseless against the psychological warfare occurring right now at her own dining table. Brad was actively laying the strategic groundwork to declare me legally incompetent. He was preparing to swallow my entire life's work in one massive gulp to cover the catastrophic debts of his secret double life. A lesser man would have flipped the heavy table right then and there. A lesser man would have grabbed Brad by his tailored collar and dragged him out onto the manicured front lawn. But my decades in construction taught me that explosive demolition is messy and leaves you with nothing but useless rubble. If you want to safely bring down a highly toxic structure, you have to locate the load-bearing pillars and carefully plant your silent charges. I needed direct access to his secrets, and I needed it immediately. I reached out to pick up my crystal glass of expensive red wine. I deliberately allowed my fingers to loosen slightly. I faked a sudden violent tremor in my right hand. The heavy crystal slipped from my grip and shattered sharply against the edge of the table. A tidal wave of dark crimson wine splashed directly onto Brad's crisp linen apron, instantly soaking right through to his expensive designer shirt beneath. "Oh, my deepest apologies," I mumbled, keeping my voice frail and appropriately embarrassed. "My hands are just not what they used to be lately." "You might be right about that cognitive decline, Brad." Brad jumped back from the table, his face briefly flashing a look of pure, unadulterated disgust before he hastily reconstructed his mask of endless patience. "It is completely fine, Leon," he said, his jaw entirely tight. "Accidents happen. I just need to go wash this out immediately before the stain sets permanently." He threw his ruined napkin on the table and hurried quickly upstairs to the master bathroom. The very moment I heard the bathroom door click shut, I stood up. Morgan was busy picking up the shattered glass shards from the floor. I told her I was going to grab a dry towel from the hallway closet. Instead, I moved silently and swiftly straight to the grand foyer where Brad had hung his suit jacket. I slipped my calloused hand into his inner breast pocket. I bypassed his sleek leather wallet and my fingers brushed against cold, cheap plastic. I pulled it out into the light. It was a prepaid burner phone. A man with absolutely nothing to hide does not carry an untraceable prepaid device concealed in the lining of his custom suit. I held the cheap plastic device flat in my broad palm. The screen was locked, but it was an older model. People look at a 69-year-old retired black contractor and naturally assume I cannot operate anything more complicated than a standard television remote. What Brad deeply underestimated was that during my final decade running my construction firm, I personally designed and integrated the advanced security frameworks and digital surveillance grids for multi-million-dollar commercial high-rises. I understand communication network protocols better than most corporate men half my age. I pressed the power button. The glowing screen demanded a standard 4-digit security PIN. Arrogant men always use predictable numbers because they subconsciously believe their secrets are utterly impenetrable. I did not bother trying Morgan's birth date or their wedding anniversary. I punched in his own birth year. The screen instantly unlocked. I did not have the luxury of time to slowly scroll through his personal text messages or search his hidden photo galleries. Brad would be out of that upstairs bathroom in less than 2 minutes. I needed a permanent invisible pipeline directly to his deceit. I navigated swiftly to the phone settings and accessed the call forwarding options. My thick fingers moved rapidly over the small digital keypad executing standard carrier codes. I set up a silent automated rule to instantly mirror and forward every single incoming text message and voice call to a secure encrypted digital number I maintained on my own primary smartphone. The entire setup took me exactly 45 seconds. It was a digital wiretap cleanly installed without leaving any physical trace on the burner device itself. He would continue to receive his messages normally, but a perfect carbon copy would be silently routed directly to me. I cleared the background applications, locked the screen, and slid the prepaid phone back into the inner pocket of his suit jacket precisely the way I had found it. I grabbed a clean hand towel from the adjacent closet and walked casually back into the dining room just as Brad came marching down the wooden stairs. He had changed into a fresh white shirt, though his mood was visibly soured by the disruption. I spent the remainder of the evening flawlessly playing the role of the tired, aging father-in-law. I nodded along at his pompous business stories, agreed with his unsolicited financial advice, and gave Morgan a warm, lingering hug before I finally took my leave. I drove my sturdy truck back to the city, my mind calculating the precise trajectory of the upcoming war. Later that night, I sat completely alone in the heavy leather chair of my darkened study. The only illumination came from the amber glow of the streetlights filtering softly through the window blinds. The large house was entirely silent. My physical body was exhausted, but my mind was operating with terrifying crystal clarity. I was systematically reviewing the complex financial documents of my real estate trusts, planning exactly how to build an impenetrable legal fortress around my assets. At exactly 11:45, my smartphone vibrated aggressively against the solid oak desk. The screen lit up, casting a harsh white light across the dark room. It was not a standard text message. It was a direct notification from my encrypted digital number. The call forwarding protocol I had installed on Brad's burner phone was functioning perfectly. I picked up the device and read the mirrored message that had just been delivered to my son-in-law. The glowing letters burned themselves permanently into my retinas. "The hospital is demanding another $5,000. Hurry up before our daughter is born. Did that old man sign the power of attorney yet?" I stared at those specific calculating words for a very long time. The final crucial piece of the structural blueprint was now fully visible. The pale morning sun was just beginning to break over the Chicago skyline when my phone shattered the quiet of my study. It was barely 6 in the morning. I answered immediately. On the other end of the line, my strong, independent daughter was sobbing uncontrollably. "Daddy," she gasped, her voice thick with panic. "It is gone. The money is just gone." I asked her to take a deep breath and explain clearly. $50,000 had vanished overnight from her primary high-yield savings account. In the background, I could clearly hear Brad pacing the hardwood floors, shouting aggressively into his phone. He was putting on a magnificent theatrical performance, cursing about international hackers, offshore syndicates, and massive cybersecurity breaches. He was telling Morgan that their bank's encryption had been compromised and that he was already filing a federal report. I listened to his muffled shouting and felt a familiar, icy resolve settle over my bones. The timing was entirely too convenient. A hospital demands $5,000 at midnight, and by dawn, $50,000 evaporates from his wife's account into the digital ether. I told Morgan to stay completely calm, to let the bank handle the fraud investigation, and to avoid doing anything drastic. I promised her I would look into it personally. I hung up the phone and walked straight to my closet to put on my best suit. Hackers do not steal exact round numbers to cover domestic crises. Desperate men do. I did not drive to the local branch down the street. I drove straight into the financial district to the towering glass headquarters of my primary wealth management firm. When you spend 40 years turning empty dirt lots into commercial skyscrapers, you learn very quickly that you never leave your money sitting in plain sight. I had structured my fortune with surgical precision. My wealth was quietly distributed across a network of impenetrable blind trusts and restricted corporate accounts. I had established a specific safety net trust for Morgan years ago, linking it as a secondary overdraft measure to her primary accounts. It was designed to protect her in catastrophic emergencies, not to fund her husband's secret life. I sat in the soundproof office of my senior private banker, a man named Harrison, who had handled my portfolio for over a decade. I instructed him to pull the exact transaction logs from the last 12 hours. Harrison frowned as his fingers danced across his polished keyboard. He turned his monitor toward me, pointing to a massive wire transfer executed at 3 in the morning. The money had not been stolen by invisible foreign hackers. It had been manually authorized. Harrison handed me the physical authorization form that had been submitted digitally to bypass the security holds. I stared at the bottom of the page. There, sitting boldly on the signature line, was my own name. It was an incredibly sophisticated forgery. The loops and angles were almost perfect, mimicking the heavy, deliberate strokes of my pen. Brad had obviously spent hours studying my signatures on the commercial contracts Morgan occasionally brought home. But he made one fatal, arrogant mistake. A man who swings a 20-ounce framing hammer for 40 years develops a very specific, uneven pressure in his dominant hand. My signature always trails off lightly at the end due to a torn tendon in my right wrist from a scaffolding accident in '98. The signature on this form was perfectly uniform. It was the smooth, uninterrupted stroke of a man who had never done a day of hard physical labor in his entire life. The sheer audacity of this boy thinking he could forge his way into my life's work ignited a quiet, dangerous fire in my chest. Harrison immediately reached for his desk phone to contact the Federal Fraud Division. I placed my heavy hand firmly over his wrist. "Do not call the authorities, Harrison," I said, my voice low and absolute. "If we report this as criminal forgery right now, the accounts will be frozen for months by a federal investigation, and the rats will scatter into the walls. I prefer to exterminate my pests personally." Harrison looked at me, swallowed hard, and slowly lowered the phone. "You follow my instructions exactly," I told him. "First, I want you to permanently sever every single financial link between my trusts and any account with Morgan or Brad's name attached to it. Revoke all authorized user privileges. Cancel the overdraft protections. Lock the vault completely. As of this exact second, they do not have access to a single penny of my money." Harrison typed rapidly, executing the absolute lockdown of my entire financial empire. Within moments, the heavy steel doors of my legacy were sealed shut. Next, I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the polished mahogany desk. "I want you to trace the exact routing number where that $50,000 landed. I need to know the final destination of my stolen money." Harrison initiated a deep trace through the clearinghouse systems. It took several tense minutes before the routing destination popped up on his secure screen. The funds had not gone to a mysterious offshore account or an anonymous cryptocurrency wallet. The money had been routed directly into a domestic commercial account registered to a limited liability company. I leaned in to read the name glowing on the monitor. Sutton Holdings, a shell company. Brad had literally stolen $50,000 from his wife's emergency reserves using my forged signature and funneled it straight into a corporate entity bearing his own last name. He was not just a cheating husband. He was a systemic financial parasite preparing to build his new life using my bricks. He was likely using Sutton Holdings to wash the stolen funds clean before redirecting them to his pregnant mistress and her hospital bills. I thanked Harrison, gathered my documents, and walked out of the bank with the cold, calculating energy of a demolition expert carrying a lit fuse. I drove back to my house, anticipating a quiet afternoon to systematically prepare my legal counteroffensive. I pulled into my driveway and noticed an unfamiliar vehicle parked near the curb, but I ignored it. I unlocked my front door and stepped into the shadowy hallway. I did not find the empty, quiet house I was expecting. Standing directly in the center of my living room holding a crisp manila folder was my son-in-law. Brad had let himself in using the spare key Morgan possessed. His sleeves were rolled up and he wore an expression of deep, manufactured sorrow. He did not flinch when I walked in. Instead, he took a slow step forward and held up a piece of official hospital stationery bearing a prominent medical crest. "Leon," he said, his voice dripping with venomous fake sympathy. "Morgan and I have been so deeply worried about your memory lapses. I took the liberty of consulting with a top neurologist about the symptoms we have observed." He tapped the paper. "The doctor has issued a preliminary diagnosis based on your erratic behavior. Early-stage Alzheimer's. You are officially losing your mind, Leon." Brad stood in my living room holding that fake medical document like a winning lottery ticket. The mask of the caring, supportive son-in-law completely melted away, revealing the greedy, desperate predator underneath. He tossed the hospital stationery onto my coffee table right next to a thick stack of legal real estate transfer deeds. He did not even bother to lower his voice or pretend to care anymore. "Let us drop the pleasantries, Leon," he said, crossing his arms over his chest. "Morgan is terrified of your mental state. She actually thinks you are a danger to yourself. And now I have the official medical documentation to prove it. You have two choices today. You can sign these deeds transferring the titles of your 3 commercial properties over to Sutton Holdings and we can handle your retirement quietly. Or I take this diagnosis straight to a judge tomorrow morning. I will have you declared legally incompetent. I will be appointed your permanent conservator, and I will have you locked away in a state-run memory care facility by the end of the month. You will spend your final years heavily medicated eating pureed food while I liquidate your empire anyway." I looked at the legal documents sitting on my table. My entire life of sweat-bleeding hands and sacrifice reduced to a few sheets of paper by a man who had never built anything of value. If I reacted with the anger burning in my chest, he would immediately use my aggression as proof of my mental instability. He wanted me to yell. He wanted me to threaten him so he could call the authorities. Instead, I did what I have done my entire life when dealing with arrogant men who underestimate me. I let him believe he was the smartest person in the room. I let my broad shoulders slump forward. I relaxed my facial muscles, allowing my eyes to widen in fabricated panic. I reached down and picked up the medical diagnosis, letting my hands shake violently. I stared at the paper, taking a slow, ragged breath that sounded like absolute defeat. "Brad," I whispered, my voice cracking perfectly, "please do not put me in a facility. I built this house with my own 2 hands. I raised Morgan in these walls after her mother passed. Do not take me away from my home." Brad smiled a cold, victorious smirk. He truly believed he had broken the old wolf. "Then sign the papers." "Leon," he demanded, tapping the deeds. I looked up at him, my eyes watering. "I will sign them." I lied, my voice barely a whisper. "I will give you the commercial properties. But please, Brad, just give me 1 week. Give me 7 days to pack my personal belongings to say goodbye to this house properly. Let me explain it to Morgan in my own way so she does not see me like this. I will sign everything over to your company next Friday." Brad studied my face. His massive ego blinded him to the trap I was setting. He saw a broken, terrified old man begging for scraps of dignity. He chuckled softly, adjusting his expensive watch. 1 week, Leon, he said, turning toward the door. Have the deeds signed and notarized by next Friday. Enjoy your final days in this house. The moment the heavy front door clicked shut, the trembling in my hands vanished instantly. My posture straightened, and the cold iron resolve returned to my veins. I did not have 1 week to pack. I had 1 week to completely obliterate his existence. I walked straight to my secure phone and dialed a number I had not used in 5 years. I called Jonathan Pierce. Jonathan was a high society corporate lawyer who swam with the deadliest sharks in the legal waters of Chicago. He was ruthless, brilliant, and he owed his entire early career to a massive favor I did for his father 3 decades ago. We met an hour later in the private back room of a quiet cigar lounge downtown. Jonathan arrived wearing a bespoke suit, taking a seat across from me. I slid the fake Alzheimer diagnosis across the table. Jonathan examined the medical crest and the signature at the bottom. "Brad Sutton is trying to use this to steal my commercial lots," I explained, pouring myself a glass of water. "I need to know exactly who this doctor is and how much it cost Brad to buy his medical license." Jonathan pulled out his encrypted tablet and immediately put his private investigators to work. We sat in silence while his team hacked into public and private records. By the time we finished our drinks, the preliminary report came back. The physician who signed my fake diagnosis was a man deeply drowning in his own vices. "The doctor is a regular at several underground card games," Jonathan said, reading from his glowing screen. "He is currently carrying a massive gambling debt. He owes a significant amount of money to some very unpleasant loan sharks on the west side. It appears your son-in-law stepped in and paid off a $60,000 marker for him last week. In exchange, the doctor provided a signed blank medical evaluation. Brad simply filled in the diagnosis he needed. It was a classic extortion play. Brad was using the money he stole from Morgan to buy the fake medical documents he needed to steal my real estate. But that was not the end of the investigation." Jonathan looked up from his tablet, his sharp eyes narrowing into a dangerous glare. He placed a heavy manila folder on the table between us. "Leon, my investigators dug deep into Brad Sutton's background while they were tracking the money," Jonathan said, his voice dropping an octave. "We found a massive discrepancy in the federal databases. Brad Sutton is currently maintaining 2 completely separate legal identities. He is using 2 parallel social security numbers to hide his assets and his past." I opened the folder and stared at the documents inside. There were tax records, property leases, and a marriage certificate from a neighboring state. Jonathan tapped the marriage certificate with his expensive pen. "Brad Sutton never divorced his first wife, Heather," Jonathan stated coldly. "He is a bigamist, Leon. His marriage to your daughter Morgan is completely legally void. He is a fraud from top to bottom." I stared at the name on the official certificate. The pregnant white woman at the clinic was not his mistress. She was his actual legal wife, and he was using my daughter to finance their entire future. Jonathan introduced me to his lead private investigator, a towering former police detective named Derek. We sat in Jonathan's soundproof office as Derek laid out the grotesque architecture of Brad's double life. He placed a thick manila dossier on the polished mahogany desk. The pregnant woman from the mall was not just a passing mistress. Her name was Heather, and she was his legal wife of 7 full years. They shared joint bank accounts, a suburban rental property, and now a child on the way. Brad deliberately targeted Morgan with cold, calculated precision. He sought out an intelligent, highly successful black woman with a wealthy, self-made father. Derek handed me printed transcripts of encrypted text messages Brad had sent to his old college fraternity brothers. The messages were vile and sickening. They exposed a deep, seething racial hatred that he hid behind his tailored suits and charming smiles. Brad privately despised black people, but he viewed my daughter and me as nothing more than a highly lucrative financial pipeline. He was systematically siphoning the generational wealth I bled for to fund a perfect traditional life with his white wife in the suburbs. He thought we were completely disposable. He actually believed his perceived racial superiority made him inherently smarter than a man who survived the brutal gang-run streets of the South Side. The sheer unadulterated arrogance of his deception did not make me scream. It made me absolutely lethally calm. I needed irrefutable, undeniable ambient audio proof of his entire scheme. A wiretapped phone was not enough anymore. I needed to capture the monster speaking freely in his own hidden sanctuary. To catch a rat, you have to be willing to go down into the sewers. I did not send Derek to do this specific job. This was deeply personal. Before I ever owned a multi-million-dollar commercial construction firm, I spent my 20s working as a union plumber fixing busted pipes in freezing basements. I know the complex vascular system of a residential house better than I know the back of my own hand. I drove to my secure storage unit and pulled out my old battered steel toolbox and a pair of faded navy blue coveralls bearing a generic municipal water department patch. I put on a pair of scuffed steel-toed boots and a worn canvas work cap. Looking in the mirror, I was no longer a wealthy real estate magnate wearing a custom suit. I was just an invisible aging utility worker. I drove my unmarked secondary truck to the quiet upscale suburban neighborhood where Brad rented a massive house for Heather, using Morgan's stolen money. I parked 2 houses down and walked directly to the exterior water main on the sidewalk. With a heavy wrench, I slightly tightened the pressure valve, cutting the water flow to the house by exactly half. Then I walked straight up the manicured stone pathway and knocked firmly on the front door. Heather opened it. She was heavily pregnant, wearing expensive silk lounge clothes purchased with my daughter's hard-earned funds. "Good afternoon, ma'am," I said, tipping my cap, keeping my voice deferential and gravelly. "City Water Department. We detected a significant pressure drop on this block, and I need to inspect your interior main line to ensure your pipes are not backing up into the foundation." She looked at me for only a second. Her inherent privilege and my perfectly crafted disguise made me completely invisible to her. She did not see her fake husband's wealthy father-in-law. She just saw an old, working-class black man doing a dirty job. She stepped aside and waved me in without a single ounce of suspicion. I stepped into the house and immediately took stock of the environment. The living room was decorated with high-end modern furniture. A massive crystal chandelier hung over a heavy, solid oak coffee table. Every single item in that room was a monument to Brad's parasitic fraud. I walked toward the kitchen sink and turned on the faucet, showing her the noticeably weakened water stream. "You definitely have a pressure blockage, ma'am," I told her, pulling a heavy pipe wrench from my steel toolbox. "I need to recalibrate the main valve under the sink, but I need a massive favor from you. Could you go up to the master bathroom on the 2nd floor and watch the bathtub faucet? Shout down to me the exact moment the water pressure returns to normal so I know the line is completely clear." Heather sighed heavily, looking highly annoyed by the inconvenience, but she agreed. She turned and slowly climbed the carpeted stairs. The absolute moment I heard her footsteps reach the 2nd floor landing, my entire demeanor shifted. I moved with the rapid, silent precision of a military operative. I abandoned the kitchen sink and moved swiftly to the center of the lavish living room. I reached into the false bottom of my steel toolbox and pulled out a high-grade micro-audio transmitter provided by Derek. It was a tactical device no larger than a standard coin, equipped with an extended lithium battery pack and a highly sensitive omnidirectional microphone. I slid gracefully onto my back and shimmied under the massive oak coffee table. I applied a thick layer of industrial adhesive to the flat top of the transmitter and pressed it firmly against the dark underside of the wooden table directly in the center, where it could clearly capture every single conversation in the open room. I held it there for 10 agonizing seconds, ensuring the chemical bond was permanent. It was completely invisible unless someone physically flipped the heavy table upside down. I scrambled out from under the table, wiped away my faint footprints on the rug, and rushed back to the kitchen sink. I quickly loosened the valve hiding under the cabinet, returning the water pressure to full capacity. From the 2nd floor, Heather shouted that the water was rushing perfectly again. I yelled my thanks, packed up my heavy tools, and met her at the bottom of the stairs. I tipped my cap again, thanked her profusely for her time, and walked out the front door, leaving my silent electronic spy safely embedded in the heart of their fraudulent home. I walked back to my truck and drove to a quiet parking lot a few blocks away. I pulled out my secure receiver, inserted a small wireless earpiece, and tuned it to the exact encrypted frequency of the transmitter. The audio quality was absolutely flawless. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator and Heather's footsteps pacing across the hardwood floors. I sat in my truck as the sun slowly set, waiting with the infinite patience of a sniper. Hours passed. The streetlights flickered on. Finally, I heard the unmistakable sound of the front door opening and closing. Brad's heavy footsteps echoed through the living room. "Hey, babe, I am home." His voice boomed through my earpiece, dripping with false exhaustion. I heard the rustle of clothing as they embraced. "How was the office today?" Heather asked, her voice entirely oblivious to the devastation funding her life. "Brutal," Brad replied, pouring himself a drink. "But it is all going to pay off very soon. I have the medical paperwork finalized. Once I toss that old black man into a mental facility, I will sell all his land and we are moving straight to Europe." I sat in the front seat of my truck long after the audio feed went silent. The sheer malice in Brad's voice was a poison I wanted to immediately drain from my daughter's life, but I knew I had to tread very carefully. I could not just drop the entire heavy dossier of bigamy fraud and hidden audio recordings on her desk at once. It would shatter her psyche completely, and Brad had already laid the tactical groundwork to make me look like a delusional, paranoid old man. I needed her to see the undeniable financial truth first. The next morning, I drove straight to Morgan's upscale architectural firm in the city. I walked into her sleek modern office and placed a few carefully redacted banking documents directly on her glass desk. I showed her the official trace of the stolen $50,000. I pointed squarely to the routing number that perfectly matched the shell company Sutton Holdings. "Morgan," I said, keeping my voice incredibly gentle and steady. "I had my private banker trace the money from your savings account. It was not taken by invisible foreign hackers. It was manually funneled into a domestic corporate account controlled entirely by your husband. You need to open your eyes and look closely at these numbers. He is bleeding you dry." Morgan stared at the crisp banking papers for a long, tense moment. I waited patiently for the realization to dawn on her face. I waited for my brilliant, highly educated daughter to connect the obvious dots. Instead, her expression hardened into a tight mask of pure indignation. She pushed the documents violently back across the glass desk, refusing to look at them for another second. "Brad warned me you might do something exactly like this," she said, her voice trembling with a deeply misplaced anger. "He told me your cognitive decline was making you intensely paranoid about our finances, Morgan," I pleaded, placing my large calloused hands flat on the desk. "Look at the routing numbers. This is concrete, undeniable proof from a federal clearinghouse." But she was already shaking her head, completely brainwashed by the smooth-talking predator who shared her bed. "You fabricated this, Dad," she snapped, standing up abruptly from her expensive leather chair. "Brad is working day and night to secure our massive financial future, and you are paying people to dig up fake dirt on him just to ruin my happiness." Her words were sharp and reckless, fueled by a desperate need to protect the illusion of her perfect husband. "Why can you not just be happy for me?" she demanded, her voice rising and echoing off the glass walls of her corner office. "Is it because he is a white man? Is that really it? You have always deeply resented the fact that I married a white man who did not come from the same struggling, impoverished background you did. You cannot stand that a successful white man is actively taking care of me, so you are trying to frame him as a common thief." The accusation hit me like a physical sledgehammer to the chest. I had spent my entire life fighting systemic prejudice, dealing with corrupt city developers who judged me solely by the color of my skin. To hear my own daughter weaponize that specific narrative against me to defend a predator who secretly despised our race was a profound and sickening tragedy. "I did not raise you to be blind, Morgan," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous low whisper. "I raised you to look at the facts." She slammed her hands down hard on the glass desk, her eyes flashing with a cold, hostile distance I had never seen before. "The only one manipulating me right now is you," she shouted, pointing a trembling finger at my chest. "You are actively trying to destroy my marriage because you are losing your mind. Brad is absolutely right. You need serious psychiatric help before you hurt yourself or someone else." She marched aggressively around the desk and stood mere inches from my face, her posture rigid and unyielding. "I want my house key back," she demanded, holding out her open palm. "You are no longer welcome in our home unless you formally apologize to my husband and agree to seek immediate medical treatment for your dementia." I looked down at the outstretched hand of my only child. This was the little girl I had carried on my shoulders through the rough streets of the South Side. This was the teenager whose expensive college tuition I paid for entirely in cash. This was the woman I loved more than my own breath, and she was actively choosing her executioner over her protector. The deep, agonizing pain of a father's ultimate heartbreak washed over me for exactly one agonizing second. Then it evaporated entirely. It was replaced by the absolute freezing cold resolve of a seasoned contractor preparing for a highly dangerous controlled demolition. You cannot save a person who is aggressively defending a burning building. If you rush in, you will both die in the flames. You have to step back, let the toxic structure collapse, and pull them from the ashes later. I reached slowly into my pocket, detached her silver spare house key from my heavy ring, and dropped it into her waiting hand. The metal clinked sharply against her diamond wedding band. I will not apologize to a thief. I said, my tone completely devoid of any paternal warmth or emotion, and I will not bother you again. But when this building falls, Morgan, do not say I did not warn you about the rotting foundation. I turned my back and walked out of her office without waiting for a single response. I did not feel sorrow anymore. I felt an overwhelming, deadly focus. Trying to reason with her was a massive tactical error. I had to let Brad's greed consume everything she valued so she could finally feel the brutal bite of his teeth for herself. I walked out to the street, but I did not leave the area. I sat in my truck across the avenue watching the entrance of her building. Through the glass facade, I saw Brad arrive exactly 30 minutes later, carrying a massive bouquet of expensive flowers and a thick leather portfolio. He embraced Morgan, acting the part of the comforting savior, soothing the deep distress I had allegedly caused her. She leaned into his chest, seeking safe refuge in the arms of the very man plotting her total ruin. I watched through my binoculars as they sat down at her large conference table. Brad opened the portfolio and slid a thick stack of legal documents directly in front of her. He pointed to the signature lines, flashing his charming trademark smile. He was clearly telling her it was the final paperwork for their massive new corporate venture. Morgan wiped a stray tear from her eye, picked up her expensive fountain pen, and signed exactly where he pointed. She did not read the fine print. She did not see that she was officially transferring the entire controlling equity of her successful architectural firm directly into Sutton Holdings. She just signed away her livelihood to a phantom. Brad did not waste a single second after securing the controlling equity of Morgan's architectural firm. Within 48 hours, he used her life's work as massive collateral to secure a highly leveraged commercial loan. He was not buying a modest starter office for his fake startup. He went straight for the crown jewel of the downtown commercial district. He purchased a stunning 10-story glass and steel luxury office building overlooking the river. It was a property that screamed wealth and established power. He immediately plastered the name Sutton Holdings in massive brushed chrome letters across the pristine marble lobby. I watched from afar as he strutted out of the revolving doors wearing a custom Italian suit, acting like a titan of industry. He threw lavish, catered lunches for contractors and drove his leased sports car with the reckless abandon of a man who believed he had finally won the ultimate prize. He thought he had successfully drained the lifeblood from my daughter and was now parading his stolen success in broad daylight. He was building his glittering empire on a foundation of absolute theft and arrogance. What Brad fundamentally failed to understand about real estate, however, is that the man whose name is on the front door rarely holds the actual power. The true power always belongs to the man who holds the paper. I sat in the soundproof conference room of Jonathan Pierce's elite downtown law firm, reviewing the dense stack of commercial loan documents his private investigators had successfully acquired. Brad had not gone to a major national bank to secure the massive loan for his new luxury building. Traditional banks require extensive background checks, verifiable tax returns, and a legitimate credit history. Brad possessed none of those things. Instead, he had gone to a boutique private lending institution known for approving high-risk commercial loans with exorbitant interest rates and draconian default clauses. It was a predatory lending house that catered to desperate developers who needed fast, untraceable cash. Jonathan poured 2 glasses of sparkling water and slid a massive leather-bound portfolio across the polished table. The private bank Brad used is currently facing a severe liquidity crisis, Jonathan explained, tapping the heavy folder. They over-leveraged themselves on bad commercial developments last quarter and are quietly looking for an immediate capital bailout to avoid total insolvency. I smiled a cold, hard smile. When you have spent 40 years accumulating massive generational wealth through disciplined commercial contracting, you do not just buy buildings. You buy the institutions that finance them. I instructed Jonathan to immediately initiate a hostile but completely anonymous acquisition of that exact private lending firm. We utilized a complex web of offshore holding companies and domestic blind trusts that I had established decades ago for asset protection. We moved with terrifying speed and absolute financial brutality. Within 72 hours, we flooded the failing bank with a massive influx of untraceable capital. In exchange for saving them from total federal collapse, my blind trust absorbed 80% of their voting shares. I effectively bought the entire bank outright without my name ever appearing on a single public document. We replaced their vulnerable board of directors with proxies completely loyal to my firm. Every single debt obligation, every commercial mortgage, and every high-interest loan that boutique bank held was now my personal property. Brad thought he had discovered a clever shortcut to immense wealth bypassing the rigorous checks of the traditional banking system. In reality, he had just bypassed all legal protections and placed his entire fraudulent operation squarely in the palm of my hand. The beauty of this strategic acquisition was the absolute invisible control it granted me. Brad Sutton was walking around downtown Chicago believing he was a brilliant young billionaire. He was completely unaware that he had just signed over the master deed of his new luxury building, the entire equity of Morgan's architectural firm, and his own personal financial liability directly to me. I was no longer just the aging black father-in-law he despised and constantly underestimated. I was the supreme commander of his entire financial existence. Every single time he swiped a credit card to buy expensive dinners for his secret pregnant wife, every time he unlocked the glass doors of his new corporate headquarters, he was doing it strictly by my quiet permission. Jonathan and I carefully reviewed the specific terms of the commercial loan Brad had aggressively negotiated. Because he was so desperate to secure the funding and project an image of massive wealth, he had foolishly agreed to a highly toxic, accelerated default clause. If Sutton Holdings missed a single payment, or if the underlying collateral was proven to be acquired through fraudulent means, the bank had the absolute unilateral right to seize all assets immediately without a prolonged court battle. Brad had eagerly put his neck into a custom-made financial guillotine and handed the heavy release rope directly to a shadow entity. I sat in Jonathan's luxurious office looking out over the sprawling city skyline. I felt a deep, profound satisfaction settling into my bones. For weeks, this arrogant predator had invaded my home, insulted my intelligence, mocked my race to his friends, and manipulated my only child into giving away her entire future. He believed he was outsmarting an old man with failing mental faculties. But I had just quietly purchased the very ground he was standing on. He was a tenant in my world now. He was living on borrowed time and borrowed money, and I owned every single second of it. I told Jonathan to lock the acquisition files away in his most secure digital vault and wait for my specific signal to drop the blade. The trap was perfectly laid. All we had to do now was wait for the rat to arrogantly march toward the cheese. We needed him to be standing at the absolute highest peak of his false mountain before we pulled the foundation out from under his polished leather shoes. 3 days later, a thick, luxurious envelope arrived in my mailbox. It was crafted from heavy cream cardstock stamped with shiny gold foil lettering. I sliced it open and pulled out an elaborate invitation. Brad was throwing a massive, lavish gala at a high-end downtown event center. It was officially billed as a grand celebration of his and Morgan's 5th wedding anniversary combined with the official corporate launch of Sutton Holdings. He had invited hundreds of wealthy socialites, industry leaders, and local politicians to witness his magnificent triumph. He wanted an audience to validate his stolen empire. But it was the personalized handwritten note at the very bottom of the elegant invitation that made my blood run absolutely cold. Brad had taken a premium fountain pen and arrogantly scribbled a direct message intended only for me. Please arrive promptly at 7 o'clock, Leon. This gala will also serve as a beautiful public farewell party before we move you into your new permanent room at the psychiatric nursing facility. Pack your bags, old man. I stared at the golden letters. He was bringing the fight to a massive public stage. That was exactly where I wanted him. It was exactly 2 a.m. on the night before the grand gala. The sprawling city of Chicago was blanketed in a heavy, freezing silence. I had not slept a single wink. You do not sleep when a predator is actively circling your perimeter. I was sitting in the driver's seat of my heavy-duty pickup truck parked inconspicuously in a dark alleyway just 1 block down from my own house. I had intentionally left my property entirely vacant for the night. Brad thought he had me completely figured out. He believed I was a terrified, deteriorating old man hiding under his blankets, dreading the inevitable public humiliation he had planned for the next evening. He was tragically mistaken. My smartphone resting on the dashboard suddenly vibrated with a series of sharp, rhythmic pulses. The screen illuminated the dark cab of my truck with a bright red warning banner. It was a silent perimeter alert from the advanced infrared security system I had personally installed around my property years ago. I tapped the notification to pull up the high-definition live video feed. The monochrome night vision footage flickered onto my screen, revealing a tall shadow moving stealthily across my back patio. The figure was dressed in completely dark clothing, wearing a black tactical beanie pulled low over his face. But you cannot disguise a man's physical gait from someone who has watched him strut around with unearned arrogance for 5 years. It was my son-in-law. Brad had come to finish the job. I reached for my thermos and poured a steaming cup of thick black coffee. The bitter dark liquid burned my throat, keeping my senses razor sharp. I took a slow, deliberate sip as I watched the live feed on my phone screen. Brad effortlessly bypassed the standard deadbolt on my back door using the exact spare key Morgan had aggressively demanded I return to her. He slipped into my dark kitchen, moving with the frantic, urgent energy of a desperate thief. He did not bother searching the living room or my home office. He knew exactly what he was looking for, and he knew exactly where I kept it. He marched straight down the hallway and entered my master bedroom. I switched the video feed to the hidden camera positioned directly above my oak dresser. Brad approached the large oil painting of the Chicago skyline hanging on the far wall. Morgan had bought me that painting for my 60th birthday. She must have told him that the heavy canvas concealed my hidden wall safe. I watched his gloved hand slide the painting aside, revealing the solid steel door of the vault. He pulled a small folded piece of paper from his pocket, illuminating it with a tiny penlight. It was my personal combination code. He had undoubtedly snooped through Morgan's private files to steal it. He quickly punched the numbers into the electronic keypad. The heavy steel bolts clicked open with a satisfying mechanical thud that I could hear perfectly through the high-grade microphones I had wired into the room. Brad swung the safe door wide open. He reached inside and grabbed the thick manila folder resting squarely in the center. The folder was clearly labeled with bold black marker reading Last Will and Testament and Property Deeds. Even through the grainy night vision camera, I could see the massive, triumphant smile spread across his face. He thought he had just successfully stolen the absolute final obstacle standing between him and my entire financial legacy. He believed he now held the physical master keys to my total ruin. I took another long sip of my black coffee, letting the dark irony of the situation wash over me. He was celebrating a total victory inside a concrete trap I had personally designed. What Brad Sutton lacked in actual intelligence, he completely made up for in pure, unadulterated hubris. He shoved the thick manila folder aggressively into his dark jacket without even bothering to open it and verify the contents. If he had possessed the basic common sense to turn on the bedroom light and read the very first page of those documents, he would have realized he was holding absolutely nothing but worthless heavy paper. Earlier that week, I had sat down with Jonathan Pierce in his secure downtown law office to meticulously construct this exact scenario. We knew Brad would eventually make a desperate physical play for my original legal documents. A man running a massive financial fraud cannot leave any loose ends that might contradict his fake narrative in probate court. So Jonathan and his elite legal team crafted a masterfully deceptive set of dummy documents. The papers inside that stolen folder were printed on the exact same heavy legal stock as my authentic will. They featured the exact same elaborate notarized seals and bore my flawlessly forged signature. They looked incredibly official to the untrained, greedy eye, but they were entirely, fundamentally useless. Jonathan had embedded a highly specific invisible micro watermark across the center of every single page. Under standard lighting, they looked like binding legal contracts, but the moment those documents were placed under an ultraviolet scanner or submitted to a federal court clerk, the watermark would brightly illuminate the words "legally void decoy document" across the text. Furthermore, we had intentionally altered one single digit in the parcel identification numbers for every commercial property listed in those fake deeds. Even if Brad somehow managed to bribe a corrupt judge to execute those specific transfer documents, he would technically be transferring ownership of an empty toxic waste dump on the far south side instead of my premium downtown commercial real estate. My actual authentic last will and testament, along with the legitimate property deeds, were resting safely inside a reinforced titanium lockbox deep within the subterranean vault of Jonathan's highly secure corporate bank. Brad was currently risking a 10-year federal prison sentence for felony burglary just to steal an elaborate prop. I watched him quickly slide the oil painting back into its original position, covering the empty steel safe. He patted the heavy folder secured in his jacket pocket, nodding to himself like a conquering general. He turned around and walked out of my master bedroom, heading back down the dark hallway toward the kitchen. His mission was completely accomplished. He possessed the fake medical diagnosis. He controlled Morgan's architectural firm, and now he believed he had successfully stolen my original will. He was ready for his grand victory lap at the gala, but the rat was not done scavenging in my home just yet. I switched my phone to the primary kitchen camera to watch him make his final exit out the back door. But Brad did not leave immediately. He stopped abruptly in the center of the kitchen floor, directly in front of the large island counter. He reached deep into his pants pocket and pulled out a small, unmarked amber glass vial. He unscrewed the tight plastic cap with a sinister, focused deliberation. I leaned closely toward the glowing screen of my phone, my jaw tightening. I watched my son-in-law step over to the large, clear glass pitcher of filtered water I kept permanently resting on the kitchen counter. It was the exact pitcher I religiously poured my morning glass of water from every single day. Brad hovered over the pitcher and slowly tipped the amber vial upside down. He emptied a heavy dose of clear, thick liquid directly into my drinking water. He gave the pitcher a gentle swirl to ensure the heavy chemical sedative mixed completely seamlessly into the water, making it entirely untraceable. He placed the empty glass vial back into his pocket, smiled a chilling, sociopathic smile, and slipped quietly out the back door into the freezing night. The sun was high and bright the following morning when the heavy roar of a luxury sports car engine broke the quiet of my street. It was exactly 10 o'clock when the doorbell rang with a sharp, aggressive buzz. I opened the door wearing a slightly oversized suit, letting my shoulders slump heavily forward to complete the illusion. Brad stood on my front porch, looking like a page out of a high-fashion magazine in his tailored midnight blue tuxedo. His face was glowing with a dangerous electric energy. "Good morning, Leon," he said loudly, clapping his hands together. "Are you ready for the big day?" I looked at him with half-closed eyes and let a slight tremor enter my right hand as I gripped the doorframe. "I feel a bit sluggish today, Brad," I mumbled, rubbing my temples slowly. I woke up terribly thirsty and drank 2 huge glasses of water from the kitchen, but I just cannot seem to shake this awful fog in my head. A flash of pure predatory triumph crossed his pale blue eyes. He truly believed his sinister plan was executing flawlessly. He thought the heavy liquid sedative he had poured into my pitcher was actively dissolving my cognitive functions. "Oh, that is just the stress of the big event, Leon," he replied, his voice dripping with fake sympathy as he firmly gripped my elbow to guide me out of the house. "Do not worry about a single thing. I will take care of you today. Let us get you into the car." What my arrogant son-in-law completely failed to realize was that I had not remained in my truck after he sped away into the freezing night. The absolute second his taillights vanished around the corner, I had walked straight back into my own kitchen. I stood over the large glass pitcher resting on the island counter, staring at the tainted water. I could have simply poured the poisoned liquid down the stainless steel drain and washed the glass clean. But my decades on construction sites taught me that when a rival contractor tries to bury you under a load of wet cement, you do not just dig yourself out. You redirect the cement mixer and pour it straight into his foundation. I knew Brad's daily routines with clinical precision. I knew that he always kept his expensive stainless steel sports bottle sitting in the center console of his leased sports car. I also knew that because he parked on the street at Morgan's house to show off his vehicle, he always left the doors unlocked. He believed living in a wealthy gated suburb made him immune to theft. I carefully poured the heavily sedated water from my glass pitcher into a plastic travel thermos. I drove my unmarked truck straight to their upscale neighborhood, parking quietly 2 blocks away. I walked through the shadows like a ghost, slipping seamlessly up to his flashy sports car. Just as I predicted, the driver door opened with a soft click. The interior smelled of expensive leather and cheap cologne. Sitting right there in the center cup holder was his insulated sports bottle, half full of his favorite electrolyte drink. I unscrewed the cap and poured every single drop of the drugged water from my thermos directly into his bottle. I gave it a gentle swirl to ensure the heavy chemical sedative mixed perfectly with his sweet sports drink. I wiped the bottle clean, screwed the cap back on tight, and closed the car door without making a single sound. I had effectively taken the highly toxic weapon he designed to destroy my public dignity and handed it right back to him. I sat heavily in the passenger seat of his low-riding sports car as we drove toward the downtown event center. Brad was practically vibrating with excitement. He had the stereo turned up loudly, playing upbeat, generic pop music, drumming his manicured fingers against the leather steering wheel. He was celebrating his ultimate victory lap, completely unaware that he was actively driving himself toward a massive financial and social execution. "You are going to love the setup, Leon," he shouted over the loud music. "We have the grand ballroom reserved. The mayor is going to be there. Top investors are flying in. It is going to be the most important day of my entire professional career. I just nodded slowly, letting my head loll against the headrest, portraying the exact image of a heavily sedated aging man. I am sure it will be unforgettable, Brad, I slurred softly. My throat is incredibly dry, though. Do you happen to have any water in here? Brad chuckled, shaking his head with a patronizing smirk. You need to stay hydrated, old man, he said, reaching down into the center console. He grabbed the stainless steel sports bottle. I only have my pre-workout drink in here, but you can have some if you are really parched. I waved my hand weakly, rejecting the offer. No, thank you, I murmured. I do not like the taste of those artificial things. I will just wait until we arrive. Suit yourself, Brad replied, shrugging his broad shoulders. He unscrewed the cap of the steel bottle and brought it to his lips. I watched out of the corner of my eye as he took a massive gulp, swallowing the cold liquid greedily. He smacked his lips, enjoying the sweet artificial flavor. He took another long, heavy swig, draining nearly half of the bottle in a matter of seconds. I stared straight ahead at the passing city skyline, keeping my breathing perfectly slow and measured. The heavy chemical sedative that was specifically intended to turn me into a babbling, incoherent spectacle was now currently digesting in his own stomach. We hit a patch of heavy downtown traffic, and Brad grew slightly impatient. He picked up the bottle one more time and finished the entire remaining contents, tilting his head back to get the very last drop. He tossed the empty metal bottle onto the back seat and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. It is showtime, Leon, he announced as we finally pulled up to the lavish valet entrance of the towering glass event center. Let us get you inside before you fall asleep in my car. We walked into the massive grand ballroom. It was absolutely breathtaking. Over 500 wealthy guests were milling around the crystal chandeliers, clinking champagne glasses and laughing. Morgan rushed over to us wearing a stunning designer evening gown, looking like an absolute queen. She kissed Brad on the cheek but kept a cold, noticeable distance from me, exactly as I expected. Brad wrapped his arm around her waist, ready to greet his audience of elite investors and city politicians. But as the bright camera flashes began to pop, something inside him suddenly shifted. I stood silently in the corner and watched the chemical reaction take hold. A heavy sheet of cold sweat instantly broke out across Brad's forehead, ruining his perfect complexion. His confident, charming smile suddenly faltered, twisting into a weird, confused grimace. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear his vision as the heavy tranquilizer began to actively short-circuit his nervous system. His tailored tuxedo suddenly looked uncomfortably tight as he swayed slightly on his expensive leather shoes. "Babe, are you feeling all right?" Morgan asked, her voice laced with sudden concern as she noticed his skin turning a sickly shade of pale gray. Brad tried to answer her, but his words came out as a thick, unintelligible slur. The main event had officially started, and the star of the show was completely losing his mind. The hired master of ceremonies tapped the microphone, signaling the start of the evening's main presentation. He enthusiastically introduced the visionary founder of Sutton Holdings to a room full of elite applause. Brad stumbled forward, stepping out from behind the velvet curtain. He completely missed the first step of the stage and had to grab the thick acrylic podium to keep from falling flat on his face. The bright spotlights hit him, and he recoiled as if physically burned. He leaned heavily into the microphone, his face shining with a thick layer of cold sweat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he mumbled, his voice echoing through the massive speakers as a slow, heavy drawl. "We are here to celebrate my massive success. I mean our success. Morgan and I. 5 years of building a beautiful empire." He swayed violently, gripping the edges of the podium so hard his knuckles turned stark white. He tried to gesture toward the VIP crowd, but his arm flailed wildly, almost knocking over a towering floral arrangement. "I am a genius," he continued, blinking slowly, his eyelids drooping as the heavy chemical sedative actively short-circuited his brain. "I took nothing and turned it into everything. Just need a little leverage. Just need to take what is mine from people who do not deserve it." The ballroom, which had been buzzing with polite applause just moments before, fell into a deeply uncomfortable, frozen silence. Elite venture capitalists exchanged highly concerned glances. Local city politicians awkwardly shifted in their seats, regretting their attendance. Morgan stood paralyzed at the front table, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes wide with absolute horror. She thought her husband was having a severe stroke or was catastrophically intoxicated. I watched him humiliate himself for exactly 2 agonizing minutes before I finally made my move. I did not rush. I walked up the short flight of stairs with the steady, measured pace of a man who owned the entire building and everyone inside it. Brad saw me approaching and tried to wave me away, but his coordination was completely shot. "Get back, old man," he slurred weakly, spittle forming at the corner of his mouth. "I am not done talking." I reached out and firmly pried his clammy fingers off the microphone. I easily stepped in front of him using my broad shoulders to block his view of the audience. He stumbled backward, collapsing heavily into a decorative velvet chair at the back of the stage. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice booming clearly and powerfully across the silent ballroom. "My name is Leon Hayes. I am Morgan's father, and I am the actual financial foundation of everything you see tonight." Brad was supposed to show you a beautiful video celebrating his 5-year anniversary with my daughter. However, I thought it would be much more appropriate to show you exactly how he celebrates his marriage behind closed doors. I reached into my tailored suit pocket and pulled out a small digital remote. Earlier today, I had a very productive conversation with the audio-visual technicians hired for this expensive event. A generous cash tip ensures absolute loyalty. I pressed the button. The massive projector screen behind me did not light up with romantic photographs or slick corporate logos. It illuminated the ballroom with crisp, high-definition images of highly classified banking documents. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of 500 wealthy guests. These were not generic spreadsheets. These were the exact heavily authenticated tracing logs I had acquired from my private banker. I pointed a strong finger at the glowing screen. "What you are looking at is a direct wire transfer," I announced, my voice echoing like thunder. $50,000 secretly drained from my daughter's emergency savings account in the middle of the night using my forged signature. I clicked the remote again, zooming in on the final destination of the stolen funds. The money did not stay in the Sutton Holdings corporate account. I explained, pacing slowly across the stage, making sure every single investor in the room understood the sheer scale of the fraud. Brad used his shiny new corporate shell as a simple washing machine. The funds were instantly routed out the very next morning to pay a massive overdue medical bill at the Oak Brook private maternity hospital. I looked directly down at my daughter. Morgan was trembling violently, her face completely drained of color. She looked from the massive screen to me and then back to her husband, who was currently slumped in the chair, drooling slightly onto his designer tuxedo lapel. I clicked the remote one more time, pulling up the hospital invoice my investigators had successfully acquired. The billing name on the account was highlighted in bright yellow marker. It read, Heather Sutton. A loud wave of murmurs and shocked whispers erupted across the sea of wealthy guests. Morgan took a shaky step forward, her voice cracking loudly. "Dad, what is this? What does that name mean? Why is his last name on a maternity bill?" I looked at my only child, feeling the heavy weight of her impending heartbreak, but knowing this surgical strike was the only way to cut the toxic cancer out of her life. "Morgan," I said gently but firmly through the microphone, "Brad is not the man you think he is. He is not a tech entrepreneur. He is a career con artist. He has been legally married to a white woman named Heather for the last 7 years. They live together in a rental property funded entirely by your hard work. And the reason he urgently needed $50,000 of your money this week is because his actual wife just gave birth to his child." Morgan let out a sound that was half gasp, half gut-wrenching sob. She turned to look at Brad. Brad tried to stand up, his eyes rolling wildly in his skull. "Lies." He shouted, his speech so slurred it was barely recognizable as human language. "It is a lie. He is crazy. He has Alzheimer's. Do not listen to the old man." He tried to point an accusing finger at me but lost his balance entirely, crashing hard into the acrylic podium and sliding down to the carpeted floor of the stage. The illusion was completely shattered. The audience was witnessing the absolute destruction of a fraud in real time. The entire luxury ballroom was descending into absolute chaos. Security guards were talking frantically into their radios, unsure whether to intervene or call an ambulance for the man thrashing on the stage. Morgan was clutching the edge of a banquet table, openly weeping as the brutal truth finally crushed her blind faith. Brad was pathetically trying to crawl across the stage floor, muttering incoherent curses and searching for an exit that did not exist. But the final nail in his coffin had not yet been hammered. Suddenly, the heavy brass double doors at the main entrance of the grand ballroom swung open with a massive, echoing crash. The crowded room parted instantly, making a wide, clear path down the center aisle. Walking confidently through the doors was my lead private investigator, Derek. But he was not alone. Walking right beside him, looking bewildered and terrified under the glaring light of hundreds of crystal chandeliers, was Heather, and wrapped tightly in a pink hospital blanket resting securely in her arms was a newborn baby. Derek had intercepted her at the maternity ward with a simple message that her husband was throwing a massive corporate launch party to celebrate their new wealth. She stepped into the venue, staring in absolute shock at the massive screen displaying her medical bills, and then down at her husband writhing pathetically on the stage. Heather stood completely frozen in the center of the grand aisle. Her wide, terrified eyes darted from the massive projector screen displaying her highly confidential medical bills to the groveling, sweating man in the tailored tuxedo on the stage. The newborn baby shifted in her arms, letting out a soft, piercing cry that seemed to cut cleanly through the heavy, suffocating silence of the ballroom. Morgan slowly lifted her head from her hands. Her tear-streaked face contorted with a mixture of profound devastation and utter disbelief. She stepped away from the banquet table and walked on shaky legs toward the center of the room. The two women finally stood face to face. They were two entirely different worlds colliding in the most catastrophic way imaginable. Morgan was dressed in her elegant designer evening gown, the absolute picture of a highly successful corporate architect. Heather was wearing a simple maternity dress, looking exhausted and deeply confused. Yet they were fundamentally bound together by the exact same web of vile lies. "You are Heather Morgan," whispered her voice, trembling so violently it barely carried over the hushed whispers of the wealthy crowd. "You are the woman he told me was just a highly demanding commercial client." Heather clutched her baby tighter against her chest, stepping back defensively. "And he told me you were just his wealthy business partner," she replied, her voice cracking under the weight of the realization. "He said he was at a corporate retreat tonight securing the final funding for our family." The horrific realization washed over both of them simultaneously. They were not business partners or clients, they were victims. They were two halves of a fraudulent double life orchestrated by a sociopathic monster. On the stage, Brad was aggressively struggling to push himself up from the carpeted floor. The heavy chemical sedative pumping through his veins had completely obliterated his internal filter and destroyed his charming facade. The polished tech entrepreneur was gone, replaced entirely by the cornered, desperate predator I always knew he was. He leaned heavily against the clear acrylic podium, gripping it with white knuckles to keep his legs from collapsing. "Shut up," he slurred loudly, his voice echoing erratically through the massive speaker system. "Both of you just shut your mouths." He pointed a shaking, clammy finger down at Heather. "I did everything for you," he shouted, stumbling over his own thick tongue. "I built this entire operation so we could have a perfect traditional life. I put a roof over your head. You were supposed to stay in the suburbs and keep your mouth shut." Heather recoiled, tears finally spilling over her pale cheeks as she realized the man she married was a complete stranger. Then Brad whipped his heavy head toward Morgan, his pale blue eyes burning with a venomous, unhinged hatred. The chemical fog stripped away his carefully crafted racial tolerance. "And you," he spat, laughing a dark, ugly laugh that made several elite investors in the front row physically flinch. "You actually thought I loved you. You thought a man like me would permanently settle down with a black woman who thinks she is smarter than everyone else. You were nothing but a walking bank account, Morgan. A highly convenient automated teller machine. You and your arrogant father both. I suffered through your family dinners. I smiled at your friends. I played the perfect progressive husband while I bled your accounts dry to fund my real family." The entire ballroom gasped in collective shock. The sheer vitriol and blatant racism spewing from his mouth was physically repulsive. Morgan doubled over, wrapping her arms tightly around her stomach as if she had been physically gutted by a blade. The man she had fiercely defended, the man she had alienated her own father for, was publicly degrading her race and her humanity in front of 500 elite guests. Brad was actively incinerating his own reputation, displaying the ugly, toxic core he had successfully hidden for 5 years. He was completely out of his mind, sweating profusely and swaying wildly, but his malicious words were his truest, absolute self. I stood perfectly still on the edge of the stage. My arms were crossed tightly over my broad chest. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I did not let a single ounce of emotion show on my weathered face. Inside, my heart was breaking into 1,000 jagged pieces for my daughter. Hearing that vile predator publicly humiliate her and degrade our heritage was the most painful experience of my entire life. But a father's ultimate duty is to protect his child, even when the necessary medicine is incredibly bitter. Morgan needed to hear those exact words from his own mouth. She needed to witness his absolute, unmasked hatred so she would never doubt the brutal reality of his deception ever again. I looked down at the sprawling crowd of venture capitalists, wealthy socialites, and local politicians. They were staring at Brad with pure, unadulterated disgust. His professional career in Chicago or anywhere else was permanently destroyed. He would never secure a single dime of investment capital again. His reputation was reduced to toxic ash. I uncrossed my arms and took a slow, deliberate step toward the center of the stage. Brad shrank back, instinctively terrified of the quiet, dangerous power radiating from my presence. "You are done talking, boy," I said, my voice low and completely absolute. "You have shown everyone exactly what you are. A coward, a thief, and a parasite." Brad tried to sneer, but his face contorted into a pathetic grimace. He wiped the cold sweat from his brow, struggling to maintain his balance. I raised my right hand and signaled to the back of the room. Moving with the smooth, predatory grace of an elite legal assassin, Jonathan Pierce stepped out from the shadows. My high-powered corporate attorney walked straight down the center aisle, his expensive leather shoes clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. He carried a thick, pristine leather briefcase tucked under his arm. The crowd parted respectfully, allowing him to approach the stage. Jonathan did not look at the weeping women or the shocked investors. His eyes were locked entirely on Brad Sutton. He climbed the short flight of stairs and stood right beside me, radiating the lethal confidence of a man holding a royal flush. "It is time to conclude this business transaction," I told Jonathan, keeping my eyes locked on my son-in-law. Jonathan opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of heavily sealed legal documents. He adjusted his suit jacket and stared at Brad with absolute professional disdain. Brad saw the heavy legal documents, and a sudden frantic wave of drug-fueled arrogance washed over his panicked face. He forcefully slapped his hand against the acrylic podium, trying desperately to regain control of the narrative. His chemically addled brain refused to accept defeat. He believed he still held the ultimate trump card. He thought he still possessed the massive commercial wealth he had stolen from my daughter. "You think a few pieces of paper can scare me?" he roared, his voice cracking wildly through the massive speakers. "You think you can just embarrass me and walk away?" He pointed a trembling, sweaty finger directly at my chest, his chest heaving with exertion. "I own Sutton Holdings. I own the controlling equity in Morgan's architectural firm. I bought this entire 10-story luxury building and my name is plastered on the front door. You cannot touch me." He took a stumbling, aggressive step forward, spittle flying from his lips as he addressed the entire shocked ballroom. "This company is mine. The building is mine. Old man, you cannot do anything to me." Brad reached into the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and violently yanked out the thick manila folder he had stolen from my wall safe just hours ago. He slammed it down hard onto the clear acrylic podium, making a sharp cracking sound that echoed through the silent ballroom. He glared at me with absolute maniacal triumph. The heavy chemical sedative was completely hijacking his nervous system, causing his facial muscles to twitch erratically, but his massive ego refused to let him surrender. "You think you are so incredibly smart, Leon," he shouted, spraying saliva across the polished stage. "You think you can trap me in front of all these people. I am always 10 steps ahead of you. I have your entire legacy right here in my hand. Your original last will and testament, your commercial property deeds. I took them right out of your hidden vault tonight. I have the medical diagnosis proving you are mentally incompetent, and I have the physical documents to immediately transfer your entire real estate empire into Sutton Holdings. I do not just own my building. I own everything you have ever built. You are absolutely nothing." The crowd gasped at the blatant, unapologetic confession of residential burglary. Morgan covered her face, weeping silently as she watched the man she loved completely unravel. Brad was so completely high on the heavy sedative and his own toxic arrogance that he did not even realize he had just publicly confessed to a major felony in front of 500 wealthy witnesses and potential investors. Jonathan Pierce did not even blink. He calmly reached into his pristine leather briefcase and withdrew a thick stack of heavily sealed legal documents. He stepped up to the acrylic podium, completely ignoring Brad's frantic posturing. He radiated the lethal calm of an apex predator closing in for the final kill. "Mr. Sutton," Jonathan said, his voice cutting through the heavy tension like a surgical scalpel. You seem to be laboring under the massive delusion that you possess actual financial power. Allow me to clarify your current legal standing." Jonathan held up a crisp official court order bearing the heavy, embossed stamp of a federal judge. 2 days ago, the boutique private lending institution that provided the massive capital for your purchase of this luxury office building was acquired in a hostile takeover. The new majority shareholder is a blind trust controlled entirely by my client, Mr. Leon Hayes. Brad's sweaty face suddenly drained of all remaining color, turning a sickly, translucent shade of gray. He stared at the documents, his mouth opening and closing silently like a suffocating fish. Jonathan continued without a single shred of mercy. "You signed a commercial loan agreement containing an accelerated default clause. That specific clause stipulates immediate asset forfeiture in the event of underlying fraud. Because you secured the collateral for that massive loan by systematically defrauding Miss Morgan Hayes through a legally void bigamous marriage, you are officially in breach of contract. This entire building, the corporate accounts of Sutton Holdings, and the controlling equity of the architectural firm you stole are hereby immediately seized. You are currently standing in a building you no longer own, Mr. Sutton. You are nothing but a trespasser." Brad staggered backward, shaking his head violently from side to side. "No," he screamed, his voice cracking in absolute terror. "No, that is impossible. You cannot take my properties. I have his deeds. I have the old man's entire estate right here." He aggressively grabbed the manila folder he had slammed onto the podium and thrust it toward Jonathan with trembling, clammy hands. "I will sell his commercial lots by tomorrow morning. I will liquidate his entire life." Jonathan looked at the folder with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. He calmly reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small black device. It was a portable high-intensity ultraviolet light scanner used for forensic document verification. Jonathan took the folder from Brad's shaking hands and pulled out the crisp legal documents. He held the heavy pages up for the entire shocked audience to see and switched on the ultraviolet light. The moment the purple beam hit the heavy paper, a massive glowing watermark illuminated across the center of every single page. The bright neon letters read, "Legally void decoy document." Brad stared at the glowing words, his pale blue eyes practically bulging out of his skull. The realization of his total failure struck him with the force of a speeding freight train. "You broke into my client's home in the middle of the night, committing felony burglary to steal an elaborate theatrical prop," Jonathan stated, his voice booming through the silent room. "My client's authentic documents have been resting securely in a subterranean bank vault for over a week. We knew you were a desperate common thief, Mr. Sutton, so we left some garbage out for you to steal." Jonathan forcefully threw the decoy documents directly into Brad's chest. The heavy papers scattered violently across the stage, fluttering down around his expensive leather shoes like dead leaves. Brad fell heavily to his knees, grasping at the scattered fake papers as if he could somehow magically make them real. The heavy chemical sedative mixed with the total psychological collapse was completely destroying his nervous system. He looked up at me, tears of sheer, unadulterated panic streaming down his sweaty face. Jonathan leaned over the acrylic podium and delivered the final crushing blow with absolute freezing precision. "Your fake empire is entirely gone, Mr. Sutton. Your stolen equity has been seized and returned to its rightful owner. You have absolutely nothing left. The only asset you currently possess is a $500,000 commercial debt owed directly to Mr. Hayes and a guaranteed federal prison sentence." Brad remained on his knees, surrounded by the scattered worthless papers that had just sealed his absolute ruin. His breathing was rapid and shallow, his chest heaving under his ruined designer tuxedo. The powerful sedative I had tricked him into drinking was completely ravaging his system, making his hands shake so violently he could barely operate his own fingers. But a cornered predator will always lash out with its final dying breath. He desperately reached into his pocket and pulled out his expensive smartphone. He believed he still had one single desperate card left to play. He thought he could salvage the entire catastrophic evening by proving I was a delusional old man having a public psychiatric episode. He frantically swiped at the cracked glass screen, his thumb slipping repeatedly before he finally hit the call button. "I have the medical proof," he yelled wildly, his voice cracking as he held the phone up to his ear. "I have the signed diagnosis from a licensed medical professional. You are all going to see that this old man is completely insane. He is suffering from severe dementia. I am calling my doctor right now and he will testify to everything." He will tell the authorities that Leon Hayes belongs in a locked psychiatric ward. The ballroom was dead silent save for the heavy breathing of the disgraced con artist and the quiet weeping of the two women he had systematically destroyed. Brad kept the phone pressed hard against his ear, waiting for his paid accomplice to answer the desperate call. A sharp electronic ringing suddenly echoed from the back of the grand ballroom, cutting cleanly through the heavy, suffocating tension. The sound did not come from the phone speaker pressed against Brad's sweaty ear. It was coming from inside the actual venue. The sea of wealthy investors and elite socialites parted quickly, forming a wide path just as they had done for Heather minutes earlier. Walking slowly down the center of that polished marble aisle was the very medical professional Brad had just desperately called. It was the corrupt physician who had willingly sold his medical ethics to pay off his massive underground gambling debts. But the doctor was not walking with the confident, arrogant stride of a respected medical authority. His head was bowed low, staring at the floor, and his expensive suit was terribly wrinkled. More importantly, his hands were secured tightly behind his back in heavy steel handcuffs. He was flanked on either side by two uniformed city police officers and a stern-looking plainclothes detective. Brad lowered his phone slowly, his jaw dropping open in absolute terror. The heavy chemical fog in his brain struggled to process the devastating image approaching the stage. He had expected his paid conspirator to arrive as a triumphant savior to validate his lies and drag me away in a medical transport. Instead, he was watching his final lifeline being paraded through the crowd like a common criminal. The detective stopped at the base of the stage and looked up at Brad with an expression of pure professional disgust. "Your doctor is not going to save you tonight, Mr. Sutton," the detective announced, his voice booming with authority. "In fact, he is the primary reason my officers are currently surrounding this entire building." Brad stumbled backward, gripping the clear acrylic podium to keep his legs from entirely giving out. He looked at the doctor, his eyes wide with a mixture of betrayal and chemical panic. "Tell them," Brad pleaded, his words slurring heavily. "Tell them the old man is sick. Tell them I paid you to do a legitimate evaluation." The doctor finally lifted his head and looked at the pathetic, sweating man on the stage. "There is no evaluation, Brad," the doctor said, his voice shaking with cowardice and defeat. "It is completely over. I told them everything. I told them about the money. The ultimate destruction of a criminal conspiracy always begins when the rats realize the ship is actively sinking beneath the waves. There is absolutely no honor among thieves, and there is certainly no loyalty among desperate men facing decades in federal prison." The detective stepped onto the first step of the stage, unrolling an official arrest warrant. "You made a fatal miscalculation when you discussed your fraudulent medical schemes in the private home you rented for your secret wife, Mr. Sutton," the detective stated loudly, ensuring every single guest in the ballroom heard the brutal facts. "The audio surveillance files provided to our department yesterday morning were incredibly thorough. We heard every single word you planned. We heard exactly how much you paid this disgraced physician to forge a fake Alzheimer diagnosis. We arrested the doctor late last night while he was leaving an illegal card game on the west side. When you corner a coward with irrefutable audio evidence of massive medical fraud and federal extortion, he will turn on his partners immediately." The doctor did not even hesitate to save his own skin. In exchange for a heavily reduced sentence and federal protection from his violent loan sharks, the good doctor spent the last 12 hours sitting in an interrogation room singing like a canary. He provided the police with a full comprehensive confession detailing the entire massive forgery ring Brad had utilized to construct his fake empire. He surrendered the blank signed medical letterheads, the fake billing statements, and the exact financial records showing Brad paying off his $60,000 gambling debt using funds directly stolen from Morgan's architectural firm. He gave the authorities everything they needed to lock Brad away for the rest of his natural life. "You turned on me!" Brad screamed, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "I paid your debts. I saved your life from those thugs." The doctor looked away, unable to maintain eye contact with the monster he had helped create. "You were going to lock an innocent old man in a psychiatric prison just to steal his real estate," the doctor mumbled weakly. "I am not going down for attempted kidnapping and elder abuse. You are entirely on your own, Brad." I stood silently on the stage, watching the absolute final pillar of Brad's fraudulent existence crumble into dust. He had tried to use the medical system to strip away my freedom and my dignity. Now, that exact same system had completely turned against him, stripping away his final defense. A sudden, piercing sound shattered the heavy atmosphere of the ballroom. It was the loud, unmistakable wail of multiple police sirens approaching rapidly from the downtown streets outside. The flashing red and blue lights began to reflect brightly against the massive glass windows of the luxury event center, painting the room in the harsh colors of incoming justice. The sheer sound of the approaching sirens triggered a massive surge of pure animal adrenaline in Brad's system, momentarily overriding the heavy chemical sedative dragging him down. The realization that he was seconds away from being placed in handcuffs and hauled into a cold concrete cell snapped his primal survival instincts into overdrive. He looked wildly around the room, his eyes darting frantically past the plainclothes detective and the uniformed officers. He was a cornered rat trapped in a cage of his own making. Without a single word of warning, Brad suddenly bolted. He shoved the clear acrylic podium violently to the side and jumped off the back edge of the stage. He hit the carpeted floor, stumbling heavily, but instantly scrambled to his feet. He began sprinting desperately toward the swinging stainless steel doors of the catering kitchen, completely abandoning his fake empire, his two weeping wives, and his shattered dignity in a pathetic, cowardly attempt to escape. Brad smashed through the heavy stainless steel doors of the catering kitchen like a feral animal fleeing a forest fire. He violently shoved past a line of terrified servers, sending silver trays of expensive appetizers crashing onto the industrial tile floor. I did not run after him. Real hunters never chase a cornered beast when they already control the entire perimeter. I simply walked down the stage stairs and calmly followed his path of destruction. Brad burst through the emergency exit doors and threw himself down the concrete stairwell leading directly to the VIP underground parking garage. His heavy footsteps echoed loudly against the cinder block walls, mixed with his ragged, panicked breathing. He was making a desperate, frantic dash for his sleek, imported sports car. That vehicle was his ultimate pride and joy. It was the shiny metallic symbol of his fake tech empire, financed completely by the blood and sweat of my daughter's architectural firm. He truly believed that if he could just get behind the leather steering wheel of that extremely fast car, he could somehow outrun the massive federal consequences of his actions. He burst into the dimly lit subterranean garage, his eyes frantically scanning the rows of luxury vehicles for his prized possession. He was sweating profusely, the chemical tranquilizer making his movements clumsy and uncoordinated, but pure desperation fueled his sprint across the damp concrete floor. He pulled his electronic key fob from his pocket, pressing the unlock button repeatedly until the sleek headlights flashed in the shadows. I pushed open the heavy fire doors to the lower garage level and stepped into the cool, damp air. The flashing red and blue lights from the police cruisers outside were casting long, eerie shadows through the upper ventilation grates, but the subterranean level was very quiet. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, measured pace of a man who held every single string in the entire puppet show. I heard the sharp electronic chirp of his car unlocking and the heavy thud of the driver door slamming shut. Brad had successfully made it into the driver's seat. He was probably gripping the leather steering wheel right now, feeling a fleeting surge of triumphant relief. He thought he was about to peel out of the parking structure and disappear into the sprawling Chicago night. I stopped walking and stood perfectly still in the shadows cast by a massive concrete support pillar. I crossed my arms over my chest and waited for the show to begin. Inside the luxury vehicle, Brad aggressively jammed his foot onto the brake pedal and forcefully pressed the illuminated ignition button. The expensive car dashboard lit up brilliantly, but the powerful turbocharged engine did not roar to life. Instead, there was only a pathetic, hollow clicking sound echoing from under the hood. Brad froze. He frantically pressed the ignition button a second time. The starter motor whined weakly, but the massive engine remained entirely, completely dead. I could hear his muffled screams of pure frustration vibrating through the expensive tinted glass. He slammed his fists violently against the steering wheel, his panic reaching an absolute fever pitch. He was a man who relied entirely on stolen wealth and superficial appearances to solve his problems. He had no fundamental understanding of how the things he owned actually worked. He tried to start the vehicle one more time, begging the machine to save his miserable life. The car simply sat there, a beautifully useless metal brick anchoring him to his inevitable fate. I stepped out from behind the concrete pillar and walked slowly into the pool of dim fluorescent light illuminating the front of his dead sports car. Brad looked up through the windshield and saw me standing there. The absolute terror in his pale blue eyes was incredibly satisfying. He aggressively pushed the driver door open, stumbling out onto the concrete floor, his tailored tuxedo completely soaked in nervous sweat. "What did you do?" he screamed, his voice cracking in total despair. "What did you do to my car?" I stopped exactly 5 feet away from his trembling frame, projecting the immovable strength of a mountain. "That is not your car, Brad," I replied, my voice low and echoing off the concrete walls. "That car belongs to my daughter, and you clearly forgot a very important detail about my past while you were busy mocking my intelligence. Long before I ever owned a multi-million-dollar commercial construction firm, I spent 10 years working as a heavy diesel mechanic on the south side of this city. I know how to completely dismantle a combustion engine with my eyes closed." Brad stared at me, his jaw hanging open as the devastating reality of his situation finally crashed down upon him. "Before you even drove to my house this morning to pick me up, I paid a very quiet visit to this parking garage," I explained, gesturing casually toward the hood of the vehicle. "It takes exactly 90 seconds to pop the hood of a modern sports car and completely disconnect the primary ignition coil packs and the main fuel injector relays. I took the essential components with me. Your engine is not going to start tonight, Brad. It is not going to start tomorrow either. You are trying to escape your consequences using a machine powered by stolen money, but you have absolutely no idea what is happening under the hood. You have spent your entire pathetic life stealing the finished products of other people's hard labor without ever learning how to actually build or fix anything yourself." Brad backed up slowly, pressing his spine against the side of the useless luxury vehicle. He looked at me, not as an aging father-in-law, but as the absolute architect of his total destruction. "You planned this," he whispered, his voice trembling violently. "You planned every single piece of this." I did not smile. I did not show an ounce of mercy. I just looked at him with absolute freezing clarity. "You tried to bury me alive, Brad," I stated coldly. "I simply provided the shovel and let you dig your own grave." The heavy steel fire doors of the subterranean garage suddenly burst open with a massive echoing crash. The plainclothes detective and 4 uniformed city police officers swarmed into the dim parking level, their tactical flashlights cutting sharply through the darkness. Brad did not even try to run. His legs finally gave out under the crushing weight of the chemical sedative and his complete psychological defeat. 2 heavily armored officers grabbed him aggressively by the shoulders, spinning him around and slamming his chest hard against the cold metal hood of the useless sports car. Brad let out a pathetic, whimpering sob as his face was pressed firmly against the polished paint. The detective stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. "Brad Sutton, you are under arrest for massive commercial fraud, felony, extortion, and bigamy," the detective announced, his voice booming through the concrete garage. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs locking tightly around his wrists echoed like a final definitive gunshot. I stood completely still and watched the cold steel secure his ultimate fate. I watched the 2 heavily armored officers shove Brad Sutton into the back of the flashing police cruiser. He did not look back at me. He simply folded into the dark leather seat, a broken and utterly defeated man. The massive heavy doors of the subterranean garage slowly hissed shut behind the departing vehicles, leaving me alone in the damp silence. I took a deep, steadying breath and walked back up the concrete stairwell toward the grand ballroom. The spectacular corporate launch party was entirely over. The hundreds of wealthy investors, elite socialites, and local politicians had fled the venue with terrifying speed, desperate to avoid being associated with a highly public federal fraud scandal. The luxurious room was now a vast empty cavern. Overturned silver catering trays, shattered champagne flutes, and discarded event programs littered the polished marble floors. It looked like the chaotic aftermath of a massive hurricane. Sitting completely alone right in the dead center of the ruined ballroom was my daughter. Morgan had collapsed onto the cold, hard floor. Her stunning designer evening gown was tangled around her knees, and her perfectly styled hair had fallen wildly around her face. The glittering facade of her perfect life had been completely stripped away, leaving nothing but raw, agonizing devastation. She was staring blankly at the massive projector screen, which had finally gone completely dark. I walked slowly down the center aisle, my heavy footsteps echoing sharply across the vast empty room. Morgan heard my approach and slowly lifted her head. Her face was streaked with thick black mascara, and her eyes were swollen and red from violent sobbing. The absolute moment she made eye contact with me, her entire body began to tremble uncontrollably. She scrambled up to her knees, crawling across the polished marble floor until she reached my feet. She reached out and tightly grabbed the fabric of my suit trousers, burying her face against my legs and weeping with a deep, agonizing sorrow that tore at my soul. "Daddy!" she cried, her voice cracking so harshly it barely sounded human. "Daddy, I am so incredibly sorry. I am so sorry." Her tears soaked directly through the fabric of my pants. She poured out every single ounce of her guilt, begging for forgiveness between heavy, ragged gasps for air. She apologized for being completely blind to his manipulation. She apologized for handing over the keys to my house and attempting to exile me from her life. She wept bitterly for weaponizing my race and my background against me, choosing to blindly trust a white con artist simply because he wore a tailored suit and spoke with false corporate authority. She realized how deeply he had brainwashed her, making her believe her own father was a paranoid, delusional old man losing his mind. I trusted a monster over the man who gave me absolutely everything, she sobbed, clutching my legs tighter. I let him insult you. I let him steal from you. I handed him my entire life on a silver platter because I was too arrogant to listen to your warnings. Please, Daddy, forgive me. I was so incredibly stupid. I looked down at the top of her head, feeling the powerful natural instinct of a father screaming at me to immediately kneel down, wrap my arms around her, and tell her everything was going to be perfectly fine. But I forced myself to remain completely still. I did not reach down to hug my daughter. I did not offer her a warm, comforting embrace or wipe the heavy tears from her ruined face. I stood towering over her, projecting the unyielding, rigid strength of a solid steel beam supporting a massive skyscraper. A collapsed foundation cannot be fixed with gentle hugs and soothing apologies. It requires brutal, heavy lifting to clear away the toxic debris and pour fresh concrete. Morgan. I said, my voice completely devoid of any soft paternal warmth. Stand up right now. She hesitated, sniffing loudly before slowly pushing herself up from the marble floor. She stood before me, shaking like a fragile leaf in a violent storm, looking at my face for any sign of soft mercy. I am not going to sugarcoat your reality, Morgan, I stated, speaking with the cold, harsh clarity of a seasoned site foreman delivering a damage report. Brad Sutton is going to federal prison for a very long time. His fraudulent empire is dead. But the catastrophic financial damage he inflicted on your architectural firm is entirely real. He leveraged every single asset you built. Your corporate accounts are completely drained. Your payroll is empty. By next Monday morning, your firm will be facing total hostile liquidation. Morgan let out a soft, devastated whimper, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. She fully understood the math. She was completely ruined. However, I continued my tone, dropping into a deadly serious register. I am the sole owner of the private bank that currently holds all of your toxic commercial debt. I have the unilateral power to instantly wipe out those highly leveraged loans and save your architectural firm from total bankruptcy. I can clear the ledger completely and give you back your company. Morgan looked up at me, her tear-filled eyes widening with a sudden desperate glimmer of hope. But there is a non-negotiable condition, I added, stepping slightly closer to her. I am not going to just hand you a free bailout. You lost your absolute respect for the value of hard work when you let a charming predator manage your success. If you want me to save your firm, you are going to work directly for my commercial real estate development company. You will manage my properties, handle my corporate tenants, and oversee my construction sites, and you will do it for exactly 0 salary for 5 consecutive years. Every single dollar of your professional labor will go directly toward repaying the massive debt you allowed that thief to accumulate. You are going to learn exactly how heavy a brick really is. Morgan swallowed hard, absorbing the brutal gravity of my non-negotiable terms. She did not argue. She did not complain about the extreme severity of a 5-year unpaid sentence. She simply looked me directly in the eyes, squared her trembling shoulders, and nodded her head in absolute submission. I accept, she whispered, her voice finally finding a small shred of steady resolve. I will do whatever it takes to earn back your respect, Daddy. I will work every single day. I gave her a single firm nod, acknowledging her commitment to the painful road of redemption ahead. But before I could speak another word, the heavy sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoed from the shadowy corner of the ruined ballroom. Stepping out from behind a toppled catering table was Heather. She was still clutching her newborn baby tightly against her chest. The look of profound shock and confusion she had worn earlier had completely vanished. It was entirely replaced by a cold, calculating stare of pure, opportunistic greed. She walked directly toward us, stopping just a few feet away. "Brad might be going to prison," she said, her voice sharp and steady. "But he stole hundreds of thousands of dollars while he was legally married to me. This baby is his only legitimate heir. You people have millions. I want a massive financial settlement right now, or I am taking this entire family to court for my rightful share of the Sutton assets." Heather stood her ground, adjusting the pink hospital blanket around her newborn baby. The bewildered victim facade she wore when she first entered the grand ballroom had completely vanished. It was instantly replaced by a hardened, predatory glare of pure, opportunistic greed. "Do not look at me like I am some crazy, desperate woman," she spat, her voice echoing sharply in the cavernous space. "Brad might be a pathetic liar, but legally I am his actual wife. Your daughter is nothing but a naive homewrecker who stole my husband to fund her fancy architectural firm. I want a $5 million settlement deposited into my primary account by tomorrow morning. If I do not see those funds cleared, I am going straight to the local news stations. I will tell every single reporter in Chicago how the wealthy and privileged Morgan Hayes intentionally destroyed a poor suburban family and stole a father away from his newborn child. I will completely ruin her professional reputation, and I will drag the Hayes family name through the absolute filthiest mud I can find. You have extremely deep pockets, Leon. You can easily afford to pay me off to keep this entire massive scandal quiet. This baby carries the Sutton name, and we are legally entitled to our proper share of whatever corporate assets you just seized from my husband." She lifted her chin aggressively, demanding a massive ransom based on sheer audacity and misplaced arrogance. I did not raise my voice. I did not blink. I simply looked at the woman attempting to extort me and let out a single cold, humorless laugh. I turned slightly and gestured to Jonathan Pierce, who was still standing quietly nearby, holding his pristine leather briefcase. Jonathan calmly popped the brass latches and withdrew a thick, heavily sealed dossier, handing it directly to me. I untied the string and pulled out a stack of crisp, high-definition, glossy photographs, alongside several printed pages of encrypted text message transcripts. I threw the entire stack forcefully onto the nearest intact banquet table, scattering the images across the white linen tablecloth. "You really should have checked your surroundings before you tried to play a game of high-stakes extortion against me." "Heather," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous freezing temperature, "my private investigator has been actively monitoring your suburban rental property for weeks. I was the municipal utility worker who supposedly fixed your water pressure last week. While you were upstairs checking the bathroom faucet, I securely mounted a highly sensitive micro-audio transmitter directly underneath your solid oak coffee table. I know absolutely everything." Heather glanced down at the photographs, and the color instantly drained from her face. There were crystal-clear pictures of her sitting at her dining room table, actively reviewing Morgan's private banking statements with Brad. There were detailed transcripts of her text messages demanding Brad transfer more of my daughter's hard-earned money to cover her expensive luxury shopping sprees. "You were not a naive victim sitting in the dark waiting for your husband to come home," I stated, stepping closer to the table and tapping a specific text message transcript with my heavy index finger. "You knew exactly what Brad was doing every single day. You knew he was actively targeting wealthy, successful black women to siphon their assets. You openly discussed the fake medical diagnosis he planned to use to lock me away in a psychiatric facility. You literally told him to hurry up and secure my commercial real estate deeds so you could both flee to Europe. You are not a distressed wife, Heather. You are a highly active, willing co-conspirator in a massive federal wire fraud and elder abuse operation. You helped him build the trap, and you gleefully spent the money he stole from my child." Heather stared at the undeniable photographic evidence of her own profound guilt. Her aggressive, demanding posture completely collapsed in an instant. The baby in her arms shifted uncomfortably as her hands began to tremble violently. "You cannot prove I understood the full extent of his crimes," she stammered, taking a weak, unsteady step backward. "I am just a mother trying to survive in a difficult situation. I will tell the judge he forced me to do it under the threat of physical violence. The federal prosecutors will not care about your pathetic fabricated excuses, I replied, my voice echoing with absolute immovable authority. The audio recordings of you laughing about my supposed dementia are crystal clear. When Jonathan hands this specific dossier over to the district attorney tomorrow morning, you will be immediately indicted on multiple felony counts of criminal conspiracy, grand larceny, and accessory to medical fraud. You will face a strict mandatory minimum of 10 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. And because both you and your husband will be actively incarcerated, the state authorities will immediately take custody of that newborn baby currently resting in your arms. Your child will go straight into the overwhelming state foster care system, and you will be completely powerless to stop it. Heather gasped audibly, covering her mouth with her free hand as the devastating reality of her situation finally crushed her greed. I reached inside the inner breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick banded stack of crisp $100 bills. It was exactly $10,000 in untraceable cash. I tossed the heavy stack onto the banquet table right on top of the incriminating photographs. The banded money landed with a heavy, satisfying thud. You currently have exactly 2 choices, Heather. I told her, delivering the absolute final ultimatum of the night. Choice number 1, you leave that stack of money on the table, you walk out those brass doors, and you wait for the federal marshals to kick down your front door at dawn. Choice number 2, you take that $10,000 in cash right now. You buy a one-way plane ticket out of the state of Illinois tonight, and you completely disappear from our lives forever. You will never contact Morgan again. You will never mention the name Hayes again. If you ever try to resurface or attempt to extract another single dime from my family, I will personally ensure you spend the rest of your natural life rotting in a cold concrete cell. I will bury you so deep under federal litigation you will never see the sun again. Make your choice right now. Heather stood completely paralyzed, staring at the thick banded stack of $100 bills resting on the white linen tablecloth. She looked at the damning evidence surrounding the cash and then looked up into my cold, unyielding eyes. She saw absolutely no mercy there. She recognized that I was a man who had built a concrete empire from absolutely nothing, and that I would effortlessly execute my legal threat without a single ounce of hesitation. The raw, greedy ambition that had fueled her pathetic extortion attempt was entirely replaced by pure, unadulterated primal terror. Her hands shook violently as she reached out and snatched the heavy stack of cash from the table, clutching it tightly against her chest right next to her sleeping newborn baby. She did not say a single word in her defense. She did not attempt to argue or demand another dollar. She simply turned on her heel, her shoes echoing loudly against the polished marble floor, and sprinted desperately toward the grand brass doors. She aggressively pushed through them and fled into the freezing Chicago night, running for her absolute life, never once looking back. 3 months passed since that freezing night in the grand ballroom. The heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse swung open, revealing a packed gallery. I sat in the front row wearing a dark charcoal suit projecting the immovable calm of a man who had already secured his victory. Brad Sutton was escorted into the courtroom wearing a faded orange prison jumpsuit, his wrists shackled tightly to a thick leather belt. He looked absolutely atrocious. The 3 months he spent sitting in a concrete cell awaiting trial had completely eroded his arrogant facade. He had lost a significant amount of weight, his tailored posture replaced by a pathetic, hollow slouch. Because Jonathan Pierce had legally seized every single one of his fraudulent assets, Brad could not afford an elite legal defense team. He was sitting next to a cheap, overworked public defender who looked entirely out of his depth. Brad's legal strategy was incredibly predictable and deeply cowardly. His lawyer was actively attempting to paint him as a victim of severe psychological pressure. He stood before the federal judge arguing that the massive stress of the competitive tech industry combined with my supposedly demanding and hostile presence, as his father-in-law had triggered a total mental breakdown. They were pleading temporary insanity, claiming Brad was completely out of his mind when he forged the medical documents and engaged in financial fraud. He wanted the jury to believe he was a broken man who simply cracked under the immense weight of modern corporate expectations. The federal prosecutor called me to the witness stand just before the lunch recess. I walked up the wooden steps with deliberate heavy strides, taking the solemn oath to tell the absolute truth. I sat in the wooden chair and adjusted the microphone, my gaze locking directly onto Brad. He tried to look away, but the sheer gravity of my presence forced him to meet my eyes. The prosecutor asked me to describe the events leading up to the corporate gala. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of anger. I spoke with the clinical precision of a site foreman detailing a massive structural failure. I explained how Brad systematically isolated my daughter, forged my signature to steal $50,000, and purchased a fake Alzheimer's diagnosis from a corrupt physician with crippling gambling debts. But the absolute centerpiece of my testimony was the digital evidence I brought with me. I handed a secure flash drive to the bailiff, who plugged it directly into the court projection system. The massive screens in the courtroom flickered to life, displaying the crisp infrared night vision footage from my master bedroom. The entire jury leaned forward collectively as they watched Brad break into my hidden wall safe using a stolen combination code. They watched him aggressively snatch the decoy legal folder, completely unaware he was stealing worthless paper. Then the prosecutor switched the video feed to the primary kitchen camera. The courtroom fell into a deafening, dead silence. Every single person in the room watched Brad pull the small amber glass vial from his dark jacket. They watched him unscrew the cap with total premeditated focus and pour the heavy chemical sedative directly into my personal drinking water. The sheer chilling deliberation of his actions completely destroyed any fabricated illusion of a temporary mental breakdown. Temporary insanity implies a sudden chaotic loss of control. What the jury was watching was a highly calculated, methodical attempted murder executed by a cold-blooded sociopath. I sat on the stand and pointed a steady finger at the frozen image of Brad holding the empty poison vial. A man who experiences a sudden mental breakdown does not purchase illegal industrial sedatives, wear tactical clothing, and execute a flawless midnight burglary, I stated, my voice booming through the federal courtroom. He knew exactly what he was doing every single second of that night. He intended to heavily drug me, drag me to a locked psychiatric ward, and leave me there to die while he liquidated my entire life. Brad's overworked public defender slowly stood up to begin his cross-examination. He nervously shuffled a stack of messy yellow legal pads, clearing his throat loudly. He was completely outgunned, and he knew it. He tried a desperate flailing tactic to introduce reasonable doubt into the minds of the jury. He paced awkwardly in front of the witness stand and aggressively questioned the authenticity of the digital security footage. He suggested that the video could have been artificially manipulated, or that the substance poured into the pitcher was simply a harmless sleep aid meant to help me rest before a stressful event. He tried to spin the narrative that Brad was acting out of a misguided sense of familial care. I let him finish his rambling, pathetic defense before I leaned forward into the microphone. "I did not just bring video footage, counselor," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly flat and unyielding. "When your client left my house that night, I immediately secured that tainted water pitcher and handed it directly to an independent forensic toxicology laboratory. I submitted their certified chemical analysis to the district attorney last month. The substance your client poured into my water was a massive, unmeasured dose of a highly restricted veterinary tranquilizer. If a 69-year-old man had consumed that entire pitcher, he would have suffered massive respiratory failure and a catastrophic cardiac arrest within 20 minutes. It was a lethal dose." The defense attorney stopped pacing his face, turning completely pale. He looked down at his yellow legal pads, realizing he had absolutely nothing left to argue. I was not finished. I leaned even closer to the microphone, ensuring my final blow landed with maximum devastating impact. "Furthermore, counselor, the only reason I'm alive to testify today is because I took that exact poisoned water and secretly poured it directly into your client's personal sports bottle the following morning. The jury can review the medical records from the downtown hospital confirming your client was treated for massive veterinary tranquilizer ingestion that very same afternoon. He literally drank the exact poison he intended to use to kill me." A loud, shocked murmur erupted from the jury box. The judge violently banged his wooden gavel, demanding immediate order in the court. The cheap public defender completely surrendered. He slowly packed up his yellow legal pads, offered no further questions, and slumped back into his chair, totally defeated. Brad's entire defense strategy had been systematically pulverized into absolute dust. There was no temporary insanity. There was no misguided care. There was only a documented, premeditated attempt to murder an elderly man for his commercial real estate fortune. The crushing reality of a guaranteed lengthy federal prison sentence finally shattered whatever tiny fragment of sanity Brad had left. He realized his cheap lawyer could not save him, and his stolen wealth was completely gone. As I stepped down from the wooden witness stand to return to my seat in the front row, Brad suddenly snapped. He aggressively shoved his public defender aside and lunged forward against the heavy wooden railing of the defendant box. The heavy steel chains around his waist rattled violently as he completely collapsed, dropping heavily to his knees right there in the middle of the federal courtroom. Tears of pure, unadulterated terror streamed down his gaunt, sunken face. "Leon, please," he wailed, his voice cracking in absolute pathetic desperation. "Please drop the attempted murder charges. I will do anything. I will sign whatever you want. I will completely give up all parental rights to the baby. I will never speak to Morgan again. Please do not let them lock me away for the rest of my life. I beg you, Leon." He was sobbing uncontrollably, his face pressed against the wooden railing, utterly humiliated and entirely broken. The federal judge struck his heavy wooden gavel, demanding that the bailiffs restore immediate order to his courtroom. Two heavily armored guards stepped forward, grabbing Brad by his shackled arms and violently hauling him back up from his knees. They forced him roughly into his wooden chair. He sat there openly weeping, his face buried in his trembling hands, a pathetic display of a broken predator who finally realized his manipulative charm could no longer save him from reality. The judge announced a brief recess to allow the jury to begin their final deliberations. The wait was excruciatingly short. When a jury returns quickly, it is never a good sign for the defense. Exactly 2 hours and 14 minutes later, the heavy oak doors beside the jury box swung open. The 12 men and women filed back into the silent courtroom, their faces carved from solid, unyielding stone. The atmosphere inside the room grew incredibly thick and suffocating. You could literally feel the heavy weight of impending justice pressing down on the stale, conditioned air. The gallery was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the ventilation system. I sat perfectly still in the front row, my large hands resting comfortably on my knees. I did not feel a single drop of anxiety or nervous anticipation. I had built the concrete foundation of this prosecution brick by painstaking brick, and I knew the structure was absolutely flawless. The judge instructed the defendant to rise and face the jury to hear his ultimate fate. Brad stood up on incredibly shaky legs, his orange prison jumpsuit hanging loosely off his rapidly emaciated frame. He looked up at the jury box, his pale blue eyes wide with pure, unadulterated terror. The jury, four-person, a stern-looking older woman, stood up holding a stack of crisp white papers. On the charge of massive commercial wire fraud, she read, her voice ringing loudly across the silent room. "We find the defendant guilty." Brad flinched as if he had been physically struck by a heavy, blunt object. "On the charge of bigamy and the systemic falsification of federal legal documents, we find the defendant guilty." She continued reading through the long, devastating list of severe felony charges. Guilty of felony extortion, guilty of elder financial abuse. And finally, on the most severe charge of premeditated attempted murder, we find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted into a loud collective gasp, but I remained entirely motionless. The judge raised his hand, demanding absolute silence before he delivered the final crushing blow. "Mr. Sutton," the judge said, looking down from his high wooden bench with an expression of pure judicial disgust, "you have orchestrated one of the most callous and sociopathic financial schemes this court has ever seen. You actively targeted an innocent family, weaponized the medical system, and attempted to murder a senior citizen purely to satisfy your own grotesque financial greed. You are a profound danger to a civilized society." The judge adjusted his glasses and looked directly into Brad's tear-streaked, terrified face. "I am sentencing you to a mandatory minimum of 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Because of the extreme predatory nature of your crimes, this sentence will be served completely without the possibility of early parole. You are remanded immediately to the custody of the federal marshals." Brad let out a guttural, agonizing scream that echoed violently off the high acoustic ceilings. It was the horrific sound of a man watching his entire existence evaporate into thin air. "No," he roared, dropping to his knees and fighting aggressively against the heavy steel chains binding his wrists. "Please, you cannot do this to me. I cannot survive in there." The two armored bailiffs moved with swift tactical precision. They grabbed him by his armpits, lifting him forcefully off the ground and dragging him backward toward the heavy steel holding doors. He kicked and thrashed wildly, screaming my name, begging for a mercy he never once showed to my daughter or me. I did not turn my head to watch him being dragged away into the dark concrete bowels of the federal justice system. I did not offer him a single fleeting glance of pity or a triumphant smirk of victory. A true professional does not stand around cheering when the demolition crew finally hauls away the toxic, hazardous debris. You simply confirm the site is entirely clear and you prepare to pour the new fresh foundation. I stood up slowly from the wooden gallery bench, projecting the massive, unyielding presence of a man who had successfully defended his bloodline from a lethal parasite. I calmly reached down and buttoned the center button of my tailored charcoal suit jacket, smoothing out a minor crease in the heavy fabric with absolute meticulous precision. The federal prosecutor walked over to me, extending a firm, respectful handshake. He congratulated me on my powerful, flawless testimony and assured me the city would be significantly safer with that monster securely locked behind heavy steel bars. I thanked him for his diligent public service and turned to walk down the center aisle of the courtroom. The large crowd of reporters, local commercial developers, and curious spectators parted immediately, creating a wide, clear path for me. They looked at me with a profound mixture of deep respect and healthy, cautious fear. They had just witnessed a 69-year-old retired black contractor systematically dismantle a young, arrogant corporate predator using nothing but pure intellect and extreme strategic patience. They finally understood that true wealth is not measured by the exorbitant cost of your tailored suit or the brand of your leased sports car. True, unshakable power is the ability to see directly through a liar's charming facade and possess the absolute ruthless discipline to let him build his own execution block. I pushed open the heavy oak double doors at the back of the courtroom and stepped out into the bright, bustling hallway. The air outside the trial room felt incredibly clean and surprisingly light. The heavy, suffocating burden I had been carrying ever since Delores grabbed my arm at that downtown shopping mall months ago was completely gone. I had protected my legacy. I had protected my daughter from total financial ruin, and I had permanently neutralized the most dangerous threat to our family. I walked with steady, rhythmic strides toward the main exit of the massive federal building, ready to breathe the fresh Chicago air and close this dark chapter forever. I pushed through the massive revolving glass doors and stepped out onto the wide granite steps of the federal courthouse. The bright afternoon sun washed over the bustling city streets, casting long, sharp shadows across the concrete pavement. Standing completely alone at the bottom of the grand staircase, waiting patiently in the freezing wind, was my daughter. Morgan was not wearing a glamorous designer evening gown or flashing any expensive jewelry. She wore a simple dark business suit, her hair pulled back into a tight, severe bun. She looked incredibly exhausted, but her posture was remarkably straight and unyielding. She had spent the last 3 months managing my most difficult construction sites, learning the brutal reality of honest labor. As I slowly walked down the stone steps toward her, she did not cry or reach out to hug me. She reached into her leather briefcase and pulled out a crisp, white envelope. She extended her hand, offering it directly to me. "This is the entire first month of my management salary, Daddy," she said, her voice completely steady and stripped of all her previous arrogance. "Every single penny is in there. It is the very first payment toward my massive debt to you. I will not stop working until the ledger is completely cleared." I took the crisp white envelope from her trembling hand and placed it smoothly into the inner breast pocket of my tailored charcoal suit. I did not smile, but I gave her a single firm nod. That silent acknowledgement was all she needed. It was the absolute beginning of her long, painful road back to true independence. Over the next 6 months, the massive 10-story luxury office building that Brad had fraudulently purchased using her stolen equity underwent a radical and deeply poetic transformation. I did not sell the premium downtown property to another soulless corporate developer to quickly recoup my financial losses. Instead, I brought in a specialized demolition crew to strip away every single obnoxious brushed chrome letter spelling out Sutton Holdings from the pristine marble lobby. I completely repurposed the entire glass and steel structure. It officially became the Hayes Foundation Incubator. I transformed the sprawling executive suites into collaborative workspaces and heavily funded business laboratories exclusively dedicated to young, ambitious black entrepreneurs from the south side of Chicago. I provided them with the legal resources, commercial backing, and administrative support they needed to launch their own legitimate companies. Where a parasitic con artist once sat plotting to steal generational wealth and mock our heritage, we were now actively building it for young men and women who possessed the exact same raw hunger and desperate determination I had when I first picked up a heavy framing hammer 40 years ago. The very building meant to solidify my absolute ruin became the unbreakable bedrock of my legacy. Morgan did not return to her previous life of glamorous high society galas or elite architectural contracts. She fully honored the strict non-negotiable terms of our agreement without a single word of complaint. I appointed her as the managing director of the new incubator facility. She was no longer designing lavish penthouses for wealthy socialites who cared absolutely nothing about her actual humanity. She was currently spending 12 grueling hours a day mentoring brilliant young minds, reviewing complex business proposals, and teaching eager kids how to fiercely protect their intellectual property from corporate predators. She used the exact same predatory lending contracts Brad had weaponized against her to teach these young developers how to spot a financial trap from a mile away. She worked relentlessly to earn her place in the world again. She drove a modest, used sedan instead of the leased luxury sports car she once flaunted. She moved into a small, practical apartment in the city, drastically downsizing her daily life to ensure every single dollar she generated went straight toward clearing her massive financial debt to me. I watched her conduct a legal seminar one Tuesday afternoon, standing confidently in front of a crowded room of young, aspiring business owners. She spoke with a raw, powerful authenticity that she had never possessed before. She was actively warning them about the dangerous, seductive allure of fast money and the absolute necessity of reading every single line of a commercial contract before handing over their signatures. She was using the catastrophic wreckage of her own profound mistakes to build an impenetrable shield for the next generation. The crushing arrogance that had blinded her for 5 years was entirely gone. It was permanently replaced by a quiet, unyielding humility and a fierce, protective instinct. She finally understood that true respect is not freely given by charming men in tailored suits who whisper sweet validations. It is painstakingly earned through brutal discipline, honest labor, and the absolute refusal to compromise your own foundational values. She was rebuilding her entire existence from absolute scratch, and for the first time in my life, I was truly and profoundly proud of the resilient woman she was becoming. Exactly 1 year after the federal gavel slammed down on Brad Sutton, sending him to a maximum security prison, I found myself walking through the exact same high-end downtown mall where this entire chaotic saga had originally begun. The crisp, comforting scent of roasted espresso once again floated through the bustling, bright corridor. I was not there to rush through my errands or buy expensive imported gifts to win the fleeting affection of a son-in-law who secretly despised me. I was there to simply enjoy the quiet, steady rhythm of a peaceful afternoon. I walked into the premium coffee shop and spotted a familiar face sitting at a small circular table near the large glass window. It was Delores, my old neighbor from the south side. The very woman whose panicked grip on my forearm and whispered warning had set this entire massive demolition into motion. She was sipping a dark roast coffee and watching the endless stream of shoppers pass by. I walked over and gently pulled out the chair across from her. She looked up, and a wide, warm smile instantly spread across her weathered face. "Leon," she said, her voice filled with genuine delight. "It is so incredibly good to see you looking so remarkably well." I ordered a simple black coffee and sat down, joining her in watching the busy world move around us. We did not discuss the horrific details of the federal trial or the pathetic fate of the man rotting in a concrete cell. We did not talk about the fake medical diagnosis or the stolen funds. We talked about the unseasonably warm Chicago weather, the upcoming neighborhood block party, and the impressive progress the young kids were making over at the Hayes Foundation incubator. We spoke like two seasoned veterans who had successfully navigated the treacherous trenches of life and earned the absolute right to simply sit in the sunlight. I took a slow sip of my bitter coffee, feeling the heavy, comforting warmth spread through my chest. The frantic, suffocating tension that had gripped my life for months was completely gone. The predators had been permanently removed from my perimeter. My daughter was finally safe and securely anchored to reality. My home was quiet and the hidden cameras were finally deactivated. My legacy was legally locked inside an impenetrable vault serving the community that actually deserved it. Delores looked at me, her wise eyes reflecting decades of hard-learned truths. "You survived a massive, terrible storm, Leon," she noted quietly, setting her ceramic cup down on the table. "You protected everything that truly mattered." I looked out through the thick glass window at the wealthy patrons carrying their expensive shopping bags, completely oblivious to the brutal realities lurking just beneath the polished surface of their comfortable lives. People spend their entire lives chasing absolute financial power. I said, my voice low and incredibly steady. They falsely believe that accumulating massive wealth will magically shield them from the deep, vicious ugliness of the world. They think a heavy bank account builds a wall that enemies cannot climb. But money does not make you strong. A massive fortune is just a tool, and a tool can be easily stolen by anyone with a charming smile and a sociopathic heart. I turn my gaze back to my old friend, feeling the absolute solid weight of my own survival. The clarity to see directly through the cruelty of human beings is the ultimate weapon. That is the only true fortress that can never be breached. Another profound truth I learned through this entire ordeal is that true love is never loud or boastful. The loudest person in the room often has the most dangerous secrets to hide. Brad used extravagant gestures and expensive tailored suits to mask his toxic hollow core, while my quiet daily sacrifices were completely taken for granted. You must always measure a person by what they do when the spotlight is turned off, not by the grand performance they give when everyone is watching. It takes immense courage to walk away from a beautifully constructed lie, but standing in the harsh sunlight of absolute truth is the only way to truly breathe. If my story resonated with you today, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Yes.